Another pretty face pretending to belong in a man's world. Matteo Belandi said it in Sicilian. Low, dismissive, certain she wouldn't understand a single word. Every man at that table laughed. Isabella Romano set down her pen, slowly, deliberately, and answered him in perfect Sicilian, not just the words, but the meaning beneath the words, revealing a secret about his own family that had been buried for 20 years. The laughter stopped. The room went so quiet, you could hear a man forget how to breathe. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. It came through a private courier service. No company name on the envelope, no return address, just a wax seal pressed in deep burgundy red and a single card inside with 2 lines of text. A time, a location, and at the bottom, a name that made every professional in the translation business either sit up straighter or quietly excuse themselves from consideration. Belandi Estate. Thursday, 8 o'clock. Isabella Romano read the card twice. Then she set it on her kitchen table and finished her coffee before she let herself think about what it meant. She had been working as a language specialist for 6 years. She spoke 5 languages fluently: Italian, Sicilian, French, Spanish, and English, and she had a working knowledge of Portuguese and Catalan that she never advertised because advertising things was not something Isabella Romano did. She got referrals through other translators, through law firms, through private clients who needed someone discreet, someone accurate, someone who understood that the space between what a person said and what a person meant was often more important than either. She had worked at corporate negotiations in Milan. She had translated legal documents for international real estate deals in Rome. She had sat in rooms where powerful men argued about money in 3 different languages simultaneously and somehow managed to keep every thread of every conversation organized and precise. But she had never worked for the Belandi family. Nobody did that lightly. Her colleague Francesca, who had referred her for the job, called that evening. "They asked for you specifically," Francesca said. "Well, they asked for the best available specialist with fluent Sicilian dialect, and your name came up. I told them you were expensive and particular about your clients. I thought that might scare them off." It didn't. Obviously it didn't. Isabella, this is the Belandi family. Matteo Belandi's private estate. His people said it's a 1-evening engagement for an international partnership agreement, some French business group finalizing terms with several Neapolitan families. They need someone who can handle the Sicilian dialect specifically, not just standard Italian. Isabella turned the card over in her fingers. Who else is going to be there? 3 other families from the south, some French investors, legal representatives, and Matteo Belandi himself. Francesca paused. His uncle Carlo will be there too. Tell me about Carlo Belandi. Older, quieter than Matteo. People say he's the one who actually runs the long-term strategy. Matteo is the face, the authority, but Carlo is the memory. He remembers everything, holds everything. Another pause. Isabella, I need to ask you directly. Do you know anything about the Romano connection to this family? Isabella was quiet for 3 full seconds. Why would I? Because your last name is Romano. And there was an Alessandro Romano who worked with Matteo's father about 20 years ago. I don't know the full story, nobody does really, but his name comes up sometimes when people talk about old business. Alessandro Romano was my father, Isabella said. Her voice was even, steady, the way it always was when she was choosing her words with precision. He died 7 years ago. Whatever connection he had to that family ended long before that. I see. Francesca was careful now. Should I decline on your behalf, I can make up a reason. Isabella picked up the card again. She read the name of the estate. She thought about her father, his handwriting, his old notebooks, the boxes she had never fully gone through that were still sitting in the storage room of her apartment in Palermo. She thought about what he used to say when she was small and asking him why people spoke differently depending on who was in the room. Because language is power, Isabella, and power always reveals itself when it thinks nobody is listening. "Don't decline," she said. "I'll take the assignment." She arrived at the Belandi estate at 7:53. A private road wound through landscaped grounds for nearly a kilometer before the main building came into view, a restored 19th century manor house with stone walls that had been standing long before anyone currently alive had been born. 3 black cars were already parked near the entrance. 2 men in dark suits stood at the front door without pretending to be anything other than what they were. The man who met her in the entry hall introduced himself as Dario. No last name, no title, and walked her through a sequence of corridors to a room on the east side of the building. He told her where she would be seated. He explained the structure of the evening. He reminded her that all conversations were confidential. He said all of this in a professional tone that made it clear these were not suggestions. Isabella nodded. She knew how these rooms worked. The dining room itself was long and formal. A marble table that could seat 20 dark wood paneling candles, supplementing the overhead lighting in a way that made the room feel older than it was. Several men were already seated or standing near the table when she arrived. She recognized the type immediately, the way expensive suits combined with a specific kind of physical stillness that came from years of understanding that you didn't need to move to show authority. Nobody paid particular attention to her when she entered. A young woman in a simple black dress with a leather portfolio under her arm was not interesting to men like these. She was infrastructure. She was a useful object like the wine glasses or the good pens. She took her assigned seat near the middle of the table to the right of where the French delegation would sit, opened her portfolio, and began reviewing her notes. She was halfway through her preparation when the room changed. Not the temperature, not the lighting. Nothing physical shifted. But the quality of attention in the space reorganized itself the way iron filings reorganize when you bring a magnet close in visible immediate total. Matteo Belandi had entered the room. Dead. He was taller than she had expected from photographs, broader through the shoulders. He wore a dark gray suit with no tie, which on most men would read as casual, but on him read as a statement, as if he had made the deliberate choice to come without the formality of a tie, because formality was something he granted to rooms, not something rooms required of him. He greeted the French investors first. Smooth practiced a handshake that communicated both warmth and an absolute ceiling on intimacy. He moved around the table with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades understanding that his time was the most valuable resource in any room he entered. Carlo Belandi arrived 2 minutes later. Matteo's uncle was shorter, heavier through the chest with silver hair cut close, and eyes that swept the room in a slow, continuous arc, cataloging everything. He sat to Matteo's left without being directed, which told Isabella everything about the nature of their relationship. The dinner began. For the first 40 minutes, Isabella worked precisely as she had been hired to work. The French lead negotiator, a man named Gautier, spoke French and occasionally English. Several of the southern Italian representatives spoke in regional dialects that occasionally needed clarification. Isabella moved between languages smoothly, quietly doing exactly what an excellent translator does, becoming temporarily invisible while making communication possible. She was aware that Carlo Belandi watched her 3 times during this period. Not obviously. Not with any expression that announced itself. But she was trained to notice the things people didn't announce, and Carlo Belandi's surveillance was systematic and constant. Matteo Belandi, by contrast, appeared not to notice her at all. That, too, she catalogued. The complication arrived over the second course. A document had been prepared, a preliminary framework agreement between the Belandi organization and the French investment group, covering the structure of a port logistics partnership in 3 southern Italian cities. The document had been drafted in standard Italian, but several clauses contained terminology that originated in older Sicilian commercial traditions, and Gautier's team wanted clarification on specific phrasing before they would sign anything. Isabella had been reviewing the document during the meal. She reached the 3rd clause on page 7, a reference to an arrangement called La Parola Stretta, literally the tight word, an old Sicilian concept for binding oral agreements that carried the same legal weight as written contracts within certain communities, and she noted the way the Italian translation in the document had rendered it. The translation was technically correct, but contextually misleading. The French version implied a formality and rigidity that the original Sicilian concept didn't carry. La parola stretta was actually more flexible than a written contract. In some ways, it depended on relationship and reputation rather than document. Rendering it as a rigid formal obligation completely changed the meaning. She made a note. She intended to raise the issue when Gautier's team reached that clause. But before she could, Gautier himself raised it, reading from his copy, and noting that the language seemed inconsistent with what he understood about Italian commercial practice. Monsieur Gautier, Isabella said, I want to clarify something about the phrasing in Clause 3. The original Sicilian concept that underlies this term carries a different weight than the Italian translation suggests. Rather than a rigid formal obligation la parola stretta traditionally operates on, she stopped. Not because she had lost her thought, but because she had looked up mid-sentence, as she often did when she was tracking whether the room was following her, and she had caught Matteo Belandi's expression. He wasn't watching her with interest. He was watching her the way a bored professor watches a student raise a hand incorrectly with the specific exhaustion of someone who already knows what's wrong before they've heard the question. He let her finish her sentence, and then, without changing his expression, he turned to the man beside him and said something in Sicilian. Dialect. Heavy. Regional. The kind of Sicilian that wasn't written in textbooks that lived in specific neighborhoods, in particular family lines, in the mouths of people who had grown up hearing it spoken in kitchens and at funerals and in rooms exactly like this one. Another pretty face, pretending to belong in a man's world. The men near him who understood it laughed, quietly, the way men laugh in rooms where they're certain the object of the laughter can't understand. Gautier looked around, not understanding the Sicilian, but understanding the tone. He smiled uncertainly. Isabella set down her pen. She looked at the document in front of her. She counted 3 breaths, not because she needed to calm herself, but because she understood that the space before a response was part of the response, and she wanted to use it correctly. Then she looked up at Matteo Belandi and answered him. In Sicilian, in his dialect, in the specific regional register of a woman who had grown up in Palermo with a grandmother who had never once in her life used standard Italian when she could use the old language instead. The pretty face, Isabella said, understands that you haven't actually answered Monsieur Gautier's question, and I'd suggest you do because the clause as written would give his organization recourse that I don't believe you intend to offer. The room went completely still, not the ordinary quiet of a pause in conversation. Something deeper, the quality of silence that happens when a room full of people simultaneously stops breathing in order to pay attention. Matteo Belandi did not move. His expression did not change. But something behind his eyes reorganized itself, and Isabella watched it happen with the calm precision of someone who had been watching things happen behind people's eyes her entire professional life. Carlo Belandi, to Matteo's left, was not still. His right hand, which had been resting on the table, pulled back a centimeter. It was an involuntary movement. Isabella noticed it. You speak Sicilian, Matteo said. In Sicilian, as if testing whether she would maintain it or retreat to Italian. I grew up in Palermo, Isabella said, staying in the dialect without hesitation. My grandmother spoke nothing else. My father... She stopped. A deliberate pause. My father believed that a language could carry things that words alone couldn't hold. He taught me to listen for what a language remembered even when the speaker had forgotten. Something moved across Matteo's face then. Fast. Gone almost before it arrived. But she saw it, because the word father had done something. And she knew from the research she had done before accepting this assignment exactly what it had done and why. Gautier, Matteo said, switching to Italian, his voice perfectly controlled again. We'll take a 10-minute recess. My team will clarify the clause in question. Yim. During the recess, two things happened. The first, a man Isabella didn't recognize, approached her near the side table where drinks were laid out and introduced himself as Marco, one of Matteo's legal staff. He asked her professionally and politely whether she would be available for additional translation work in the coming weeks. She said she would check her schedule. He handed her a card. The second, Carlo Bellondi walked past her on his way to the corridor. He didn't stop. He didn't look at her directly. But as he passed, he said very quietly in Sicilian, "You should be careful about what old languages remember." He said it pleasantly, the way you might comment on the weather. Isabella turned to watch him go. She held the comment in her mind, turned it over, examined it the way she examined a text in translation, looking for the space between what was said and what was meant. It wasn't a warning about language. It was a warning about her. The dinner resumed. Isabella continued her work. She was professionally impeccable for the remainder of the evening, precise, unobtrusive, exactly what she had been hired to be. But something had changed in the room's orientation toward her. The French investors, who had been politely ignoring her the way they ignored the table settings, now watched her with a different attention. Two of the southern Italian representatives, who had previously spoken among themselves in dialect, assuming, as people often assumed, that she was monitoring rather than understanding, were more careful now, and Matteo Bellondi did not look at her again, not once. For the remaining 90 minutes of the dinner, he directed his attention entirely elsewhere, which told Isabella more than any amount of looking would have. When a powerful man who has been embarrassed in front of his peers stops paying obvious attention to you, it does not mean you have stopped mattering to him. It means you have become the thing he is thinking about most. She gathered her portfolio at the end of the evening. She said quiet professional goodbyes to the appropriate people. She accepted the envelope with her fee from Dario, thanked him, and walked toward the front entrance. She was almost to the door when she heard footsteps behind her. Deliberate, unhurried. She didn't turn around. She kept walking. "Signorina Romano?" Matteo Bellondi's voice, behind her. Maybe 4 meters. She stopped. She turned. He stood in the corridor with his jacket open, hands loose at his sides, the first time all evening she had seen him in a posture that wasn't performing command. He looked for just a moment like what he actually was. Underneath the reputation, a man in his early 40s, who had learned too early that the world only responded to force and had spent decades being right about that, and had just encountered his first exception. "Your father," he said. "Alessandro Romano." "Yes." Her voice was steady. "He worked with my father, years ago." He studied her face. "I didn't know he had a daughter who spoke Sicilian." "There are many things people don't know about Alessandro Romano," Isabella said. "He preferred it that way." Matteo was quiet for a moment, in the low light of the corridor with the dinner sounds behind him. And the night ahead of her, he looked less like a legend and more like a man working out a calculation he hadn't expected to encounter. "How did he die?" Matteo asked. The question surprised her. Not because it was inappropriate in this world. Direct questions about the dead were sometimes the most respectful thing you could ask, but because the way he asked it quietly without the armor of authority suggested that the answer mattered to him for a reason he wasn't going to explain. "Alone," she said. "In Palermo." He was 63 years old. He had been ill for 2 years. She paused. He never stopped working, though. Even at the end, he had files and notebooks everywhere. He said there were things he needed to finish before... She stopped herself. He said he needed to finish things. Something in Matteo's face closed slightly, not with coldness, with a kind of recognition that was also a kind of grief. "I see," he said. That was all. He nodded to her a formal, precise acknowledgement and turned back toward the dining room. Isabella watched him go. She thought about her father's notebooks. She thought about the 3 boxes in her storage room that she had moved twice without opening because she was not ready to read them yet. She thought about what Francesca had said. His name comes up sometimes when people talk about old business. She thought about Carlo Bellondi's hand pulling back 1 centimeter when she mentioned her father in Sicilian. She walked out into the night air, She called for her car. She sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the long private road leading away from the estate, and she thought about what her father used to say. Power always reveals itself when it thinks nobody is listening. She had been listening for 31 years, and tonight, for the first time, she thought she might be ready to understand what she'd heard.
Sir.
The call came 4 days later, not from Dario, not from the legal representative who had handed her the card. From a number she didn't recognize to a phone she used only for professional work, with a caller who did not identify himself, but who said in precise standard Italian, "Mr. Belandi would like to offer you a consulting position for the next 3 months. The scope involves translation and cultural interpretation for several ongoing international matters. The fee structure is attached to the email you received 1 minute ago from the Belandi corporate office." Isabella checked her email. The fee structure was there. It was significant enough to make her sit down. "I'll review the terms," she said. "I'll respond by Friday." She hung up. She put the phone down. She went to the storage room of her apartment and stood in front of the 3 boxes that had her father's name written on the sides in her own handwriting from 7 years ago. She had moved them twice. She had told herself she would open them when she was ready. She was not sure she was ready now, but she was sure in the way she was always sure of the things that mattered quietly, completely, without dramatics, that the time for leaving them closed was ending. She took the first box down from the shelf. She sat on the floor of the storage room with it in her lap. She opened it. Alessandro Romano had been in the official record a business consultant and language specialist who had worked with several major Neapolitan families during the 1990s and early 2000s. This was accurate as far as it went. What the official record did not mention was that Alessandro Romano had also been, for a period of approximately 4 years, an internal advisor to Vittorio Belandi, Matteo's father, operating specifically in the area of financial compliance and organizational integrity. Isabella had known this in the broad outlines. Her father had told her in the last year of his life that he had worked for powerful people and that some of that work had ended badly. He had said it without elaborating. She had not pressed him because he was dying, and she was learning slowly and painfully that some conversations needed to wait. She had not realized until she opened the first box that her father had not waited. The notebooks were dense. Her father wrote in a hand she had known since childhood, small, precise, the letters close together, as if he was trying to conserve space, even on a blank page. He wrote in a mixture of Italian Sicilian dialect and a private shorthand that she recognized from his old shopping lists and appointment books. She had always been able to read his shorthand. He had taught it to her when she was 12, telling her it was their private language, a language that belonged only to them. She spent 2 hours in the storage room working through the first notebook. By the time she reached the 43rd page, her hands were not entirely steady. Her father had not left unfinished work because he was disorganized or because illness had interrupted him. He had left unfinished work because he had been building something methodically over years that he had not had time to complete. A record. A documented account of what he had witnessed and what he had been told, and what he had eventually understood about the events that had ended his career and his connection to the Belandi family. It was not a confession. It was a testimony. And the name that appeared most frequently in the margins, always with a small mark beside it, that meant verify in his shorthand, was a name she already knew. Carlo Belandi. She accepted the consulting position on Friday morning. She called the number she had been given and spoke to the same unidentified voice and said simply that she was available to begin the following Monday. The voice said the details would be forwarded. She thanked him and hung up. She had one weekend. She spent it reading. By Sunday evening, she had gone through all 3 boxes. She had organized her father's notebooks into a sequence she believed was chronological. She had cross-referenced his shorthand notes with the formal documents that were also in the boxes. Some of them official business records, some of them internal memoranda that carried the Belandi organization's letterhead, some of them handwritten correspondence that carried no letterhead at all. She did not understand everything she was reading. Some of the financial terminology required knowledge she didn't have. Some of the references to specific transactions required context that her father had encoded in ways she couldn't fully decode. But she understood enough. She understood that her father had discovered something inside the Belandi organization's financial structure, something that pointed to deliberate manipulation of funds over a period of years in a way that had benefited one specific person and had systematically obscured that benefit from Vittorio Belandi himself. She understood that her father had brought his concerns to someone he trusted inside the family, and that this had been a mistake, and that the consequence of this mistake had been the destruction of Alessandro Romano's professional reputation, his exile from the organization. And though her father did not say this directly in the notebooks, because saying things directly was not how he wrote a form of ongoing pressure that had followed him for years afterward, she understood that her father had spent the last years of his life building documentation of what he had found, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of something she recognized as his particular form of faith. The belief that the truth, if carefully preserved, would eventually be able to speak for itself. He had believed that. He had died before he could finish the work of making it possible. Isabella sat with the last notebook in her hands for a long time on Sunday night. She thought about the conversation in the corridor, Matteo's face, when she said her father's name, the specific quality of recognition that had moved through his expression. She thought about Carlo Belandi saying in a pleasant voice that she should be careful about what old languages remembered. She thought about the fact that Matteo Belandi had invited her into his world 4 days after she had spoken Sicilian in his dining room, and revealed in the way that her answer had revealed it, that she was not who he had assumed she was. She thought about what it meant to finish unfinished work. And then she put the notebooks carefully back in order, closed the box, and went to bed. She had an early start on Monday. Ciao. The Belandi corporate offices occupied the upper 3 floors of a building in the Chiaia district of Naples. It was a serious building. Old architecture, new interior, the kind of space that communicated that the people inside it had access to both history and money, and were comfortable with both. Isabella arrived at 8:45. She was shown to a conference room on the 2nd floor of the organization's floor, not the top floor, which she noted and introduced to 2 people who would be her primary contacts. A lawyer named Rinaldi, who handled international matters, and a logistics coordinator named Ferreira, who managed the French partnership documentation. They briefed her on the scope of work. There were 12 active documentation packages requiring translation review. There were 4 upcoming calls with French counterparts that would require live interpretation. There were also, Rinaldi mentioned carefully, several historical documents that Mr. Belandi wanted reviewed for accuracy of Sicilian dialect usage documents relating to older partnership agreements that were being referenced in the current negotiations. What kind of historical documents? Isabella asked. Rinaldi passed her a preliminary list. She scanned it. Most of the dates were from the 1990s and early 2000s, the period during which her father had worked for Vittorio Belandi. I can work with these, she said. Her voice was professional and calm. Excellent, Rinaldi said. Mr. Belandi may want to meet with you directly at some point to discuss the historical context. He's been reviewing some of these older files himself and has questions about certain language choices. I'm available whenever he wants to meet, Isabella said. She meant it in more than one way. She worked in the conference room for 3 hours on her first day. She was thorough and precise and did exactly what she had been hired to do. At 12:30, the door opened, and Matteo Belandi walked in. He was in a dark suit again, no tie again. He carried a coffee and nothing else. He looked at the documents spread across the conference table, then at her, and then he pulled out a chair and sat across from her without preamble. My uncle tells me I shouldn't trust you, he said. He said it in Italian, directly, without introduction or softening. Isabella looked at him. Your uncle doesn't know me. He says you have a reason for being here that isn't professional. I have a professional reason for being here, she said. You hired me. The work is real. I'm doing it. She paused. Whether I also have other reasons isn't something your uncle's opinion changes. Matteo studied her. He did it openly, without the careful indirection that most powerful people used. The way he looked at a problem she was beginning to understand was directly, which was both his strength, and she suspected the thing that had most often been used against him. My father spoke highly of Alessandro Romano, he said. When I was young. He said your father was one of the most honest men he'd worked with. Isabella didn't respond immediately. She let the statement sit. And then, Matteo continued, your father apparently accused someone inside our organization of financial crimes. And my father chose to believe that your father was lying, and Alessandro Romano was removed from any connection to our family, and his reputation was, he stopped, damaged, destroyed, Isabella said quietly. The word is destroyed. Matteo didn't look away. Yes. Do you know who your father chose to believe instead? Matteo was quiet for 3 seconds. I have suspicions, he said. That's partly why you're here. Isabella looked at the documents in front of her. She thought about the boxes in her storage room. She thought about her father's handwriting, small and careful, preserving things he believed deserved to be preserved. I have some materials that might be relevant to your suspicions, she said. Matteo's eyes sharpened. What kind of materials? My father's notes, from the years he worked with your family. She looked up at him. He was a careful man. He believed in documentation. He spent a long time building a record of what he had seen. The silence in the room was different from the silence in the dining room 4 days ago. That silence had been the silence of shock. This one was the silence of two people who understood they were standing at the edge of something that once crossed could not be uncrossed. Why would you bring this to me? Matteo asked. His voice was careful now, precise in a different way than his authority had been precise. If your father was wronged by my family, he was wronged by someone in your family, Isabella said. That's not the same thing. She met his eyes. Your father trusted mine. Whatever was done to damage that trust, it was done to both of them. Your father never knew the truth either. Matteo was very still. Bring me the materials, he said. Whatever your father left. I'll bring you the ones I've deciphered, Isabella said. He wrote in a private shorthand. There are sections I haven't fully translated yet. You can read his shorthand. He taught it to me when I was 12. He called it our private language. She picked up her pen and returned her attention to the document in front of her. He believed languages could carry things that ordinary words couldn't hold. She glanced up once more. He was right. Matteo stood slowly. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was not the way he had looked at her across the dinner table. Not dismissive, not surprised, not calculating. Something more uncertain than any of those. Something she thought that might be the beginning of actually seeing her. He left without saying anything else. Isabella turned back to her work. Outside the building somewhere in Naples, the ordinary afternoon continued traffic and voices and the sounds of a city that had been built over centuries on the understanding that power was real and that its shape changed, and that occasionally, if you paid close enough attention, you could hear the moment it began to change again. She was paying attention. She had been paying attention her entire life, and she was only beginning. She brought the first notebook on Wednesday, not all of them. Not yet. She had thought carefully about this, about the order in which things should be revealed, about the difference between giving someone the full weight of a truth all at once, and giving them enough to begin walking toward it themselves. Her father had understood this. He had been a patient man, Alessandro Romano. Patient in the way that people are patient when they have learned through experience that the right moment for a truth matters as much as the truth itself. She brought the first notebook in a plain canvas bag, wrapped in a piece of cloth, the way her father had always carried his most important documents. Not in a briefcase. Not in something that announced its own importance. Just wrapped and carried and protected by the ordinariness of its container. Rinaldi met her at the building entrance and escorted her not to the conference room on the second floor, but to the elevator, and the elevator went to the top floor. and she understood that things had shifted. Mateo's private office was large and uncluttered. Books on 3 walls, real books, red ones with creased spines, and papers tucked between pages. A desk that faced the door rather than the window, which told her something about how he thought about power. He wanted to see who was coming, not to be seen from behind. 2 chairs across from the desk, a low table between them. He was standing when she came in. He gestured to one of the chairs and took the other himself, which was not what she had expected. She had expected him behind the desk. This was more deliberate and more honest than the desk would have been. She sat. She set the canvas bag on the low table between them. She did not open it immediately. "Before I show you this," she said, "I need you to understand something about how my father worked." Mateo nodded once. He didn't build this record because he wanted to destroy anyone. He built it because he believed that the truth had weight, that it existed whether or not anyone acknowledged it, and that somebody needed to carry it until it could be properly set down. She paused. He spent years carrying it. It cost him more than you probably know. "Tell me what it cost him," Mateo said. Not a deflection, a direct request. His reputation first. That was the obvious part. After he was removed from your father's circle, nobody in the industry would work with him. People who had called him a friend stopped returning his calls. She kept her voice level. Then his health. The stress of knowing something and having no way to speak it, it does things to a person over time. Things that don't show up immediately, but accumulate. She looked at the canvas bag. And his sense of himself. That might have been the worst part. He was a man who believed in honesty, the way other people believe in God, completely structurally, as the thing that made everything else make sense. When honest men are called liars by people with more power than them, something inside them breaks that never fully heals. Mateo was quiet. He was watching her with the same directness she had noticed on Monday. Not comfortable, not performing attention, actually paying it. "He never stopped believing your father was a good man," Isabella said. "Even after everything. He said Vittorio Bellondi was someone who genuinely wanted to do right by the people around him. He said what happened to Alessandro Romano wasn't Vittorio's fault. It was the fault of the person who worked very hard to make sure Vittorio never had the right information." She opened the canvas bag and took out the notebook. She set it on the table between them. Mateo looked at it. He didn't reach for it immediately. "How much of this can you read?" he asked. "All of it. The shorthand is dense in places, but I know the system." She turned to a page she had marked with a slip of paper. "I want to start here. This is the entry from the week your father removed my father from the organization." She held the notebook out. He took it. He read. She watched him read. She was good at watching people read, because their faces, when they were focused on a text and believed nobody was observing them, told you more than their faces ever did in conversation. She watched the precise moment when Mateo's jaw tightened. She watched him reread a sentence, his eyes tracking back to the beginning of a line he had already covered. She watched him reach the bottom of the page and not turn it, just sitting with the weight of what was on that page for a long moment before his hand moved. He read for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he set the notebook down on the table very carefully, as if it were something fragile, and sat back in his chair and looked at her. "Carlo," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's the name that appears most frequently in the margin of those entries," she said. "My father trusted him absolutely." "I know. Carlo raised me after my father died. He was the one who—" Mateo stopped. He looked at the wall for a moment. When he looked back at her, his expression had the specific quality of a man who is holding something together through will alone. "He told me stories about my father for years. He shaped what I understood about who my father was and what he valued, and how he built what he built. And if some of those stories were constructed to serve Carlo's interests, rather than to tell the truth about Vittorio Bellondi," Isabella said carefully, "then you might not know your father as well as you believe you do." The silence that followed was long enough that she could hear the city through the building's walls, a distant car horn voices somewhere far below. "How much more is in those boxes?" Mateo asked. "Enough," she said. My father was methodical. He built a record over years. I haven't finished translating everything, but what I've read so far suggests he had access to documentation, internal documents, some of them that traces specific financial transactions across a period of about a decade. Matteo leaned forward. Where did he get internal documents? He was inside long enough to copy things. She met his eyes directly. He knew before the end that he was going to be removed. He didn't know exactly when, but he could feel it coming. He started making copies of things he thought might matter. She let that land. He was preparing for exactly this conversation. He just wasn't able to have it himself. Matteo stood. He walked to the window, not dramatically, just the movement of a man who needed 3 seconds of distance to absorb something, and then turned back. I need you to translate everything, he said. All of it, whatever's in those boxes. That will take time. Some of the financial terminology requires whatever resources you need, whatever support, whatever it takes. His voice was controlled, but there was something under the control now, something that hadn't been there in the dining room or in the conference room, something that sounded, she thought, like urgency, that was also grief. I need to know what my father actually built, not the version Carlo gave me, the real version. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had mocked her across a dinner table 6 days ago. This man whose uncle had warned her pleasantly and precisely to be careful about what old languages remembered. I'll bring everything Thursday, she said. I'll need a secure space to work. You'll have one. She picked up the canvas bag. She left the notebook on the table, the first one, the one with the entries from the week that had changed her father's life. She thought Matteo needed it there, needed the physical presence of it. At the door, she stopped. One more thing. He was still standing by the window. He looked at her. Carlo is going to realize something is happening, she said. Maybe not immediately, but soon. He's been watching me since the dinner last week. He's been careful, but I've noticed. I know, Matteo said. Carlo notices everything. Then you should know that whatever we find in my father's notes, whatever the documentation shows, there will be a moment when it becomes visible, when it stops being something only you and I know and becomes something that has to be acted on. She held his gaze. When that moment comes, Carlo will move. He's not someone who waits for someone else to define the situation. Matteo held her gaze. Neither am I, he said. She left. She spent the next 2 days translating from morning until late at night. She had set up a workspace in her apartment, the dining table cleared and covered with her father's notebooks arranged in chronological order, a separate notebook of her own, where she transcribed the shorthand into plain text. A laptop open to cross-reference any financial terminology she wasn't certain about. She worked systematically the way her father had taught her to approach a dense text. Start with the overall structure before going to the details. Identify the recurring patterns. First, let the specific instances illuminate the pattern rather than trying to build the pattern up from individual pieces. What emerged as she worked deeper into the notebooks was a picture that was both more specific and more devastating than she had initially understood. Carlo Belandi had, over a period beginning approximately 8 years before Alessandro Romano joined the organization, and continuing through the years her father worked there, systematically redirected funds from certain of the Belandi organization's legitimate business operations into a separate financial structure that was not visible in the organization's official accounts. The amounts were not reckless. They were calibrated, always proportional enough to avoid triggering the kind of internal scrutiny that larger discrepancies might have prompted. But over a decade, the accumulation was significant. Her father had done the arithmetic in the margins of one notebook using approximate figures, and even the conservative estimate was enough to make her sit back from the table and press her hands flat against the surface for a moment. What made it worse, what made it genuinely dangerous in a way that went beyond money, was the companion structure Carlo had built to support it. Because redirecting funds required documentation, legitimate-looking documentation. And creating that documentation required either corrupting the people responsible for the organization's financial records or creating a secondary layer of paperwork that appeared to authorize transactions it was actually obscuring. Carlo had done both. He had cultivated specific people inside the organization over years. People who owed him people he had helped or protected or elevated into positions where their cooperation was useful. He had built inside the Belandi organization a network of obligation that answered to him rather than to Vittorio. Her father had begun to see the edges of this network in his first year with the organization. He had documented his observations carefully, the way a scientist documents anomalies before forming a hypothesis. He had asked careful questions of the wrong people. Wrong, not because they were hostile to him, but because they were without his knowing it inside the obligation network, and his questions had traveled back to Carlo before her father understood the risk. The entry dated 11 days before Alessandro Romano was formally removed from the organization was the hardest one to read. Her father had written, "I made the mistake of trusting the wrong person with the right information. I don't know yet who carries more responsibility for this, the person who betrayed a confidence or me for not understanding the room I was in before I spoke. V has been told I fabricated concerns to damage Carlo's position. I could see in V's face that he didn't entirely believe this, but I could also see that he loves his brother more than he doubts him, and love is a more powerful force than evidence in most human situations. I have copies of everything. I am going to need to be patient in a way I have never had to be patient before. I am going to trust that what is true has weight, and that weight eventually finds its level." She stopped reading when she reached that passage. She read it 3 times. She felt the specific grief of recognizing a parent in their fullest human dimension, not as the protective presence of childhood memory, not as the diminished figure of illness, but as a person complete, carrying the weight of something difficult with more grace than they had probably ever let her see. "What is true has weight," she said aloud to nobody. She went back to translating. Thursday morning, she arrived at the Belandi building with both remaining boxes in the car, and a transcription of everything she had finished so far. 47 pages of plain text organized chronologically with her own notes in the margins explaining context. Rinaldi met her in the lobby. He looked uncomfortable in a way that was just slightly more visible than usual, which she noted. "Mr. Belandi is in a meeting," he said. "He asked me to take you to the secure workspace he's arranged and let you know he'll be there within the hour." "Of course," she said. She was set up in a room she hadn't been in before, on the top floor 2 doors from Matteo's office. A room with a long table and no exterior windows and a keypad entry. A secure space as requested. She began laying out her materials. She had been working for 20 minutes when she heard voices in the corridor outside. Not arguing. Not quite. But close enough to arguing that the distinction barely mattered. Carlo Belandi's voice low and precise. "The Romano woman is on this floor now." A voice she didn't recognize responding quietly. Carlo again. "I don't care what Matteo has decided. That family is a liability we resolved 20 years ago, and there's no reason to reopen something that's closed." The other voice said something she couldn't hear. Carlo Alessandro Romano spent the last years of his life trying to build a case against this organization. If his daughter has inherited his work, a pause. "Make sure I know every document she brings into this building." Footsteps, receding. Isabella set down her pen very slowly. She looked at the door. She listened to the silence that followed. She had known in the abstract that Carlo would move. She had told Matteo exactly that. But there was a difference between understanding something intellectually and hearing the specific, quiet voice of a man who had destroyed her father's life discussing whether she was a problem that needed to be managed. She breathed. Once slowly. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. She had 43 more pages to transcribe. Tid. Matteo arrived 55 minutes later. He closed the door and looked at the boxes and the organized piles of material and the transcription she had already produced. And something moved across his face that she had begun to recognize as his version of being affected by something. A brief, involuntary expression controlled almost immediately, but not quite quickly enough. "You've been busy," he said. "I told you my father was methodical. The transcription goes faster once you know the shorthand system." She turned a page and indicated a section she had marked. "I need to show you this before we discuss anything else." She walked him through it, the financial structure, the documentation, the timeline. She explained the shorthand as she went translating sections aloud when he asked, slowing down at the points where the evidence was most specific. She was precise and professional, and she kept her personal feelings in a separate compartment. While she did this, the way she kept languages in separate compartments available, but not interfering with each other. Matteo listened without interrupting for 22 minutes. When she stopped, he said, "How long had Carlo been doing this before your father arrived?" "At least 8 years before. Possibly longer. My father's documentation only covers what he could directly observe, and some of the earlier records he references would need to be verified against the organization's own financial archives." "Which Carlo controls access to." "Which Carlo controls access to," she confirmed. Matteo sat down. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his fingertips together and stared at the transcription pages for a moment. She waited. "He sat beside me through my father's funeral," Matteo said, very quietly. "He held my arm during the burial. He told me..." He stopped. He reset. "He told me that my father's greatest regret was that he hadn't trusted his instincts about certain people earlier. He said that in the last months of my father's life, my father had come to realize that sentimentality about loyalty could be a vulnerability." His voice was completely controlled. He was describing himself. "He was telling me at my father's funeral that loyalty was a weakness, and he was describing himself as the example of someone my father should have been less loyal to. And I thought he was teaching me a lesson about business." Isabella said nothing. Some moments didn't need response. They needed witness. "He raised me," Matteo said. "After my father died, I was 23. I knew nothing about running this organization. Carlo was the one who taught me. He was the one who..." He stopped again. His jaw tightened. "Everything I believe I know about how to lead, how to make decisions, how to identify who to trust, I learned from a man who spent 20 years stealing from my father." "He also taught you to be direct," she said. "To look at things as they are, rather than as you wish they were." She met his eyes when he looked up. "That's what you're doing right now. He may have built that in you for his own purposes. It doesn't mean it isn't real." Matteo looked at her for a long moment. "My father was right about Alessandro Romano," he said. "Yes. He was an honest man." "Yes," she said. "He was." The silence held for a moment. Then Matteo said, "Carlo came to see me this morning, before my meeting. He told me you were a risk to the organization. He said your father had spent years building a false narrative about our family, and that you were here to complete that work." He paused. He was very calm about it, very reasonable. He made a very organized argument. "He's had 20 years to practice that argument," Isabella said. "He asked me to end your contract today." She held herself very still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd consider it." Matteo looked directly at her. "I said it to buy time. I've been watching Carlo for 20 years without understanding what I was watching. I'm not going to move before I understand the full picture." She felt something she hadn't entirely expected, not relief, because she hadn't let herself anticipate a particular outcome, but a kind of settling, as if the floor had confirmed it was solid. "There's something else," she said. She turned to page 31 of her transcription. She had flagged this section with 2 slips of paper, not one. "My father documented the financial structure, but he also documented something else, something that he clearly considered even more significant, though he was more careful about how he wrote it." She pointed to the passage. "There was a specific business arrangement in 2001, a major transaction that was represented to your father as a clean deal, a partnership with a legitimate shipping company in Marseille. Your father signed off on it. He trusted the numbers Carlo presented. Matteo read the passage. His expression didn't change, but his hand resting flat on the table pressed down slightly harder against the surface. The shipping company, he said slowly, was partially owned by people your father had tracked to a money laundering network operating through 4 ports in 3 countries, she finished. Yes, and if your father had known that if he had understood what he was actually signing, he would never have agreed to it. But Carlo structured the presentation to make it look clean. And your father, who trusted Carlo completely, didn't look deeper. Matteo stood up. He walked 3 steps away from the table and stopped with his back to her for a moment. When he turned around, his face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. The control was still there. The structure of the expression was still intact, but underneath it, something had broken open slightly. Not dramatically. Not in any way he would let be visible in a room with anyone else. But she was close enough and attentive enough to see it. That transaction, he said. The Marseille deal. My father was proud of it. He talked about it as proof that the organization could build clean relationships with European partners. He said it was what he wanted his legacy to be, not the old ways, but new structures built on honest partnerships. I know, Isabella said. My father wrote about that too. He wrote about how much Vittorio cared about building something clean. How much he talked about wanting the organization he left to his son to be something different from what it had been when he inherited it. The silence in the room was very dense. Carlo took that from him too, Matteo said. It wasn't just the money. He took my father's attempt to build something honest, and he turned it into the opposite thing without my father ever knowing. Yes. Matteo's voice when he spoke again was quiet in a way that was not calm. It was the quiet of something very large being held with enormous care. I need to see the rest. I'll have everything translated by early next week. Is there anything in what you've read so far, anything that my father initiated or approved knowingly? I need to know if he... No, she said. Immediately, without equivocation. My father was very clear about that. Vittorio Belandi did not know. He trusted the wrong person, and he was deceived by someone who understood exactly which trust to exploit. She paused. That's not the same as being complicit. My father was very specific about distinguishing between the two. Something in Matteo's posture changed. Not a collapse, nothing like that. But a release of tension that had been so constant, she hadn't noticed it until it shifted. Thank you, he said. He said it simply without any architecture of authority around it. Just 2 words. She nodded once. I'm going to have Rinaldi pull the financial archives for 2001 through 2005, Matteo said. His voice was reorganizing itself now, moving back toward the decision-making register, the place where he was most at home. Whatever the original documents show will either support or contradict what your father documented. If they support it, you'll have contemporary evidence, not just my father's record. She understood where he was going. That's the piece that makes it verifiable. My father's notebooks are a testimony. The original documents are proof. Can you help me read the financial records? Identify what to look for. Yes. He nodded. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Isabella. He used her name without the title. She noticed. Carlo knows you're here. He's going to keep watching. I want you to tell me immediately if anything happens, if you feel any pressure from any direction that makes you uncomfortable. She looked at him. I heard him in the hallway this morning, when I was setting up. He was talking to someone about making sure he knew every document I brought into the building. Matteo's expression didn't change, but the temperature of the room changed slightly, the way it changes when someone makes a decision. I see, he said. I'm not frightened, she said. I want you to know that. My father was frightened, and he was right to be. I understand the reality of who your uncle is, but I didn't come this far to be careful about it. Matteo looked at her for a long moment. She thought he might say something. He didn't. He left. She went back to work. The financial archives arrived on Friday afternoon, 12 boxes of organized documents from the relevant years delivered to her secure room by 2 members of Rinaldi's staff. She understood that pulling those records without Carlo knowing would have been nearly impossible, which meant either Carlo knew and was letting Matteo see them because he believed they were clean, which meant he had already removed anything damaging years ago, or Matteo had found a way to pull them outside Carlo's visibility, which would have required careful maneuvering. She opened the first box. She found the Marseille deal documents in the third folder of the second box. They were organized and complete, which meant Carlo had either not thought to remove them or had left them because he believed they were uninformative without context. He was wrong. Her father's shorthand had given her the context. And with the context, what the official documents showed was not a clean transaction with a legitimate European partner. It was a masterfully constructed paper trail that, if you knew where to look, had seams in it places where the language shifted slightly, where the authorization signatures appeared in a different sequence than the document dates would suggest, where a single reference number appeared in two different forms, in two different sub-documents, in a way that shouldn't have been possible if both documents reflected the same underlying reality. She photographed every relevant page. She was on the fourth box when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. It said in plain Italian, "The documents you're looking at are above your pay grade. Stop now, and this ends here. Continue, and the consequences will not be professional." She stared at the message for a moment. She took a screenshot. She saved it. Then she put the phone face down on the table and opened the fifth box. She was not going to stop. She had not come this far, and her father had not spent the last years of his life building something for her to carry for her to stop, because a man who had been stealing for 20 years sent her a text message on a Friday afternoon. She found what she was looking for in the eighth box. It was a memorandum. Internal, dated 2003. From Carlo Belandi, to a financial contact whose name appeared in her father's notebooks under the shorthand mark that meant central to the scheme. The memo outlined in language that was technically deniable but structurally explicit the next stage of the financial redirection program. It used terminology that only made sense if you understood the overall structure, the kind of terminology that assumed the recipient already knew what was being referred to. Her father had not had this document. He had documented the pattern and suspected the details. But this was the detail itself, a record that Carlo Belandi had written and signed in 2003 that presupposed the entire structure her father had spent years trying to prove existed. Her hands were steady as she photographed it. Her voice when she called Matteo 15 minutes later was calm. "I found something," she said. "You need to see it today." He came within 20 minutes. She showed him the memorandum. She watched his face as he read it. She watched the moment when he understood what he was looking at, not just what it showed about Carlo, but what it showed about the entire landscape of his inheritance. Everything he had believed he'd built on his own, after his father, everything Carlo had shaped and influenced and positioned. He set the document down. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "My father built this organization for me. He spent his life building something that he wanted to leave to his son. Something that he tried to make honest." His voice was very quiet. "Carlo spent 20 years making sure I never knew what my father actually wanted. He gave me a version of my father's legacy that was built on what Carlo needed me to believe." "Yes," Isabella said. "He didn't just steal money." Matteo looked at her. "He stole my father." The room was very quiet. Isabella thought about her own father, about the notebooks, about the shorthand he had taught her in a Palermo kitchen when she was 12 years old, about the boxes she had moved twice without opening, about the patience he had written about the weight of truth, the faith that what is real eventually finds its level. She thought about the fact that she was sitting here in this room with these documents having this conversation with this man. Her father had not been able to finish his work, but his work was not unfinished. It had simply been waiting for the moment when the right person could carry it to the place where it needed to land. "He didn't steal your father," she said. "He tried to, but Vittorio Belandi's actual legacy is in those notebooks my father wrote, in every entry where Alessandro Romano described your father as a man who wanted to build something honest. That record exists. Carlo couldn't touch it." She paused. and now you know it." Matteo looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. "Rinaldi," he said, "I need you to arrange a meeting, private, tomorrow morning. There are some financial records I need to review with the internal audit team." A pause. "No, don't tell Carlo. This is separate from his regular briefings." He hung up. He looked at Isabella. "This is going to get complicated," he said. "It was already complicated," she said. "Now it's just going to get visible." And Matteo Bellondi, who had spent 20 years learning everything about power, from the man who had been deceiving him for all of it, nodded once and began to understand that what he was about to face would require more than power. It would require exactly the thing he had dismissed across a dinner table 10 days ago, in a language he had assumed she couldn't understand. It would require the capacity to recognize what was real. He was beginning to learn. The internal audit meeting happened on a Saturday. Matteo had chosen Saturday deliberately. The building ran on a skeleton staff on weekends maintenance, a few security personnel, the people whose jobs didn't follow a Monday through Friday schedule. Carlo Bellondi, who kept rigid habits after decades of disciplined organization, did not come into the office on Saturdays. He spent Saturday mornings at the same private club he had been going to for 30 years, and Saturday afternoons at the home of his eldest son in Posillipo, and he had done this so consistently for so long that the pattern had stopped being a schedule and had become simply the shape of the week. Matteo had known this about his uncle for years. He had never previously considered that this knowledge might be useful. 3 members of the internal audit team arrived at 9 in the morning through a side entrance that Rinaldi had opened specifically for this purpose. They were people Matteo had vetted personally over the past 48 hours, cross-referencing their professional histories against the network of obligation her father had documented, checking whether any of their names appeared in the margins of Alessandro Romano's notebooks under any of his shorthand marks for compromised or loyal to Carlo. None of them did. That was not a guarantee of anything, but it was as close to one as the current situation allowed. Isabella was already there when they arrived. She had the transcription documents organized and flagged. She had the photographs of the financial archive documents sorted by date and cross-referenced against her father's notebook entries. She had built over the preceding 2 days a presentation of the evidence that moved from the earliest anomalies her father had detected through to the 2003 memorandum she had found in the 8th archive box, a timeline that showed not a series of isolated incidents, but a continuous, deliberate, architecturally sophisticated campaign. She presented it in 2 hours and 14 minutes. The auditors asked questions. She answered them. When they asked about the source of her father's original observations, she was direct. He had been an insider who documented what he witnessed in real time. Motivated not by personal gain, but by professional obligation to the man he was working for. When they asked whether her personal connection to the material affected its reliability, she said, "The documentation is primary. Read the documents. The notebooks provide context and cross-referencing. The documents stand on their own." One auditor, a woman named Greco, who had the precise, unsentimental quality of someone who had spent 20 years reading financial records and had long since stopped being surprised by what people did with money, looked up from the 2003 memorandum and said, "If this is authentic, this isn't just internal financial misconduct. This is a structured fraud that would have had implications for every major partnership the organization entered during this period." "I know," Matteo said. He was standing near the door, letting Isabella run the presentation, which she understood was a deliberate choice. He was watching the auditors' faces with the attention of a man cataloging how trustworthy people looked when confronted with something real. Greco looked at him. "Mr. Bellondi, I have to ask you directly. Did you have any knowledge of any aspect of this structure during the period it was operating?" "No," Matteo said. "I inherited the organization after my father died when I was 23. Carlo Bellondi managed the transition. He controlled my access to the historical financial records for the first several years, and by the time I was operating independently, the relevant period was far enough in the past that I had no reason to dig back into it." He paused. I had no reason to question it, because the person who would have told me there was something to question was the same person who built the structure I should have been questioning. Greco nodded. She went back to the documents. The meeting ended at 11:15. Greco and her colleagues left with copies of the relevant materials, not originals copies, because Isabella had learned from her father that you never surrendered the only version of something that mattered. Matteo walked them out. Isabella began reorganizing the documents. She was halfway through when she felt the specific quality of attention that told her she was not alone in a room she had believed was empty. She turned. Carlo Bellondi was standing in the doorway. He was not supposed to be here. His Saturday pattern was ironclad. She had been told the building's weekend staff had been briefed to log all arrivals. She had been working in this room for 2 hours with a keypad entry, and she had not heard the door open. She understood in the space of one breath that he had a code for this door that wasn't on the system Rinaldi had briefed her from. That he had arrived without triggering the usual log. That he had been standing there for some period of time she didn't know, watching her reorganize documents he recognized. He was dressed as if he had come from the club. A dark jacket, silver tie. Everything impeccably maintained in the way of a man who understood that appearance was its own form of communication. He looked at the organized piles on the table. He looked at the photographs. He looked at her. His expression was the same as it had been in the corridor of the estate 2 weeks ago. Pleasant, contained with a specific quality of intelligence behind it, that she was now reading very differently than she had initially. "Signorina Romano," he said, "you've been busy." She put down the documents she was holding. She did not step backward. She did not let her posture change. "Signor Bellondi," she said. He walked into the room, unhurried. He moved around the far side of the table, looking at the materials from a distance, not touching anything. She tracked his movement and kept the table between them. "You know," he said conversationally, "your father was a genuinely gifted man. I want you to understand that I'm saying that sincerely. Alessandro Romano was one of the most perceptive people I ever encountered in a professional context." He stopped at the far end of the table. His flaw was a common one. He was more gifted at seeing the world clearly than he was at understanding that some truths are better left where they are. "Some people call that a virtue," Isabella said, "not a flaw." "Some people," Carlo agreed pleasantly. "And those people, in my experience, tend to pay for their virtues in ways they didn't anticipate." He looked at the documents on the table again. "What you've assembled here is impressive. It reflects the same methodical quality your father had. He would be proud of you." "I know he would," she said. "That's why I'm here." Something shifted very slightly in Carlo's expression. Not anger, he was too controlled for anger to surface visibly. But the pleasantness became slightly thinner, like ice over water. "Matteo hasn't seen all of this yet, I presume." "Matteo has seen all of it," she said. The thin pleasantness went thinner still. "I see. He pulled the financial archives on Friday. I found the 2003 memorandum yesterday. He saw it yesterday afternoon." She held Carlo's gaze. "You wrote it, you signed it, and you kept it in the archive because you believed the context required to understand it had been eliminated when my father was removed from the organization." Carlo was very still. "A memorandum can mean many things." "This one means one thing," she said. "We both know that." He looked at her for a moment. She watched him recalibrate, watched the process of a very intelligent man adjusting to information that changed his assessment of his own position. He did it smoothly, with very little visible sign of the adjustment taking place. But she saw it because she had spent 2 weeks learning how this man moved and what his stillness meant. "Matteo is going to need guidance about how to interpret what he thinks he's found," Carlo said. "He trusts me. He's trusted me for 20 years. That trust doesn't dissolve because a dead man's daughter brings boxes of papers and a theory." "It's not a theory," she said. "And you know it isn't. What Matteo knows and what can be proven are different things." "The audit team has the documents now," she said. "Copies. They left 40 minutes ago. The calculation in Carlo's face shifted again, faster this time. Who did Matteo use? I don't think that's information that serves you, she said. Carlo looked at her for 3 full seconds. It was the look of a man deciding something. You don't understand what you've started, he said. And now the pleasantness was entirely gone. What was underneath it was not rage. It was something colder and more considered, the expression of a man who had been operating for 30 years in an environment where problems were not left unsolved. The organization my brother built, the organization Matteo leads, is held together by relationships and understandings that go far deeper than any financial record. If you destabilize those relationships, I'm not here to destabilize anything, Isabella said. Her voice was completely steady. I'm here to give Matteo the truth about what his father actually built and what was done to undermine it. What he does with that truth is his decision, not mine. And if his decision causes damage that can't be repaired, then that damage is the consequence of what you built over 30 years, she said, not of my father's notebooks. Carlo stared at her. She held it. She did not look away. She did not adjust her posture. She breathed evenly and looked at the man who had destroyed her father's professional life and his sense of himself and his capacity to ever feel safe again. And she held the eye contact with everything her father had given her. The patience, the faith in the weight of truth, the understanding that the space before a response was part of the response. The door opened. Matteo walked in. He took in the room in approximately 1 second, Isabella across the table. Carlo at the far end. The organized documents between them and his face went very still in a way she had not seen before. Not the controlled stillness of his public authority. Something deeper. The stillness of a man who has just confirmed something he hoped was not true and understood exactly what its confirmation meant. Carlo, he said. Matteo. Carlo turned to face his nephew with the smooth adjustment of a man who had been navigating difficult rooms for 3 decades. We should talk privately. We're going to talk here, Matteo said. Carlo paused. He read something in Matteo's voice. She could see him reading it, filing it, assessing. Matteo, what this woman has shown you is a construction, a narrative built from incomplete documentation by someone with a family grievance. I understand why it looks. I found the Marseille records myself, Carlo. Matteo's voice was quiet, the quietest she had heard it. After Isabella showed me what to look for, I went back to the originals. I sat with them for 3 hours last night. I'm not a financial specialist, but I can read a document. I can see when a reference number appears in 2 different formats in 2 documents that are supposed to be part of the same transaction. He paused. I can also see when I look at the authorization sequence in the Marseille deal that 2 of the signatures appear in a sequence that would have required my father to authorize something before he was presented with the information that was supposed to justify the authorization. Which means the document sequence was constructed after the fact. Carlo said nothing. My father signed documents that were built around his signature not because of it, Matteo said. Someone arranged the paperwork so that it looked like he had reviewed and approved things that were actually already done. Someone who had access to both the documentation process and to my father's signing habits well enough to construct a sequence that looked legitimate. Matteo, you managed the Marseille partnership documentation personally, Matteo said. It's in the internal log. Rinaldi pulled it this morning. The room was very quiet. Carlo's expression did not collapse. She gave him that he did not break. He did not plead. He did not reach for an emotion that wasn't there. He held himself with the self-possession of a man who had prepared somewhere in the back of his mind for the possibility that this conversation might eventually happen, and who had decided long ago how he would conduct himself if it did. I made decisions that I believed were in the organization's best interests, Carlo said, in a period when the organization was under significant external pressure. Some of those decisions required a flexibility that the formal record may not reflect accurately. That's not what this is, Matteo said. Don't do that. Matteo, I raised you. Don't. Mateo's voice stayed quiet. That was the most frightening thing about it. She thought that it didn't rise, didn't harden into obvious anger, stayed at exactly the same pitch, and controlled and deliberate. I know what you did. I know why you removed Alessandro Romano. I know what you told my father about him. I know that my father believed you because you were his brother, and because you had spent years making sure you were the person he trusted most. And I know that trust was how you kept him from seeing what you were doing inside his organization. Carlo looked at him. He was proud of the Marseille deal, Matteo said. He talked about it as his legacy, something clean, something honest, something that showed the organization could be something different. His voice was still quiet, still controlled. You let him be proud of that. You sat across from him at dinner, and you let him talk about his legacy, and you knew what you had built inside it. Your father was not as... Carlo stopped himself. Finish that sentence, Matteo said. Carlo was silent. My father was not as what Carlo? Not as careful, not as intelligent, not as capable of making those decisions himself if he'd had the real information. Matteo took one step forward. Or were you going to say he was not as strong? Because I know you believe that. I know you believe that strength is the only thing that matters, and that my father's instinct toward honesty was a vulnerability you compensated for. I know you believe that because you taught me to believe it too. He stopped. But it turns out that the only person in this building whose honesty was a problem to you was the person who was honest about what you were doing. Carlo looked at Isabella then. He looked at her for 3 seconds, the full direct acknowledging look of a man who understood that he was standing in a position that had been built by a woman he had tried to dismiss as a liability. Your father would have been very proud, he said to her. He said it without warmth, but he said it without malice either, as if it was simply the most accurate thing available to say. I know, she said. Carlo looked back at Matteo. What happens now? It wasn't a question. It was a man who had spent 30 years controlling outcomes asking for the first time to be informed of one. Now you tell me everything, Matteo said. Not the version you've constructed, not the narrative that protects your position. Everything. He paused. And then we determine what this organization owes to the people who were damaged by what you built. Something moved across Carlo's face. She thought it might be underneath all the architecture of control and intelligence, and 30 years of practiced self-possession, something close to relief. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has finally been asked to set it down. He sat down. He began to talk. He talked for 3 hours. Isabella stayed. Matteo did not ask her to leave, and she did not offer to. She sat to one side with her transcription notes and her father's photographs, and she listened to Carlo Bellondi dismantle piece by piece the version of history that he had spent 30 years constructing. It was not a confession in the emotional sense. There were no tears, no overt remorse, no dramatic moment of collapse. Carlo was too disciplined for that, and perhaps too old to find a new shape for feelings he had long since learned not to inhabit. But it was complete. He answered Matteo's questions directly. He confirmed the financial structure. He confirmed the timeline. He confirmed the specific mechanisms he had used, the people he had cultivated, the documentation he had managed, the way he had controlled information flow between Vittorio and the operational reality of the organization. He confirmed what he had done to Alessandro Romano. He came to me, Carlo said. He had found inconsistencies in the second quarter accounts for 2003. He wasn't certain yet. He was asking me to help him understand what he was seeing. Carlo paused. I told him his interpretation was incorrect, and that he had misunderstood the account structure. He accepted that. But 2 weeks later he came back, and this time he had more. He had cross-referenced what he found against earlier records, and he was no longer uncertain. Carlo's voice was flat factual. I had 4 days between his second meeting with me and his planned meeting with Vittorio. I used those 4 days. What did you tell my father? Matteo asked. I told Vittorio that Alessandro Romano had been approached by a competitor organization, that he was building a false record inside our financial accounts to use as leverage as manufactured evidence of misconduct that could be used to damage us externally if his actual clients ever needed a tool against us. Carlo looked at his hands. I told Vittorio that Alessandro's loyalty had been purchased, and I told him that Alessandro was planning to bring him fabricated documentation within the week. And he believed you. He believed me for two reasons. First, because I had given him 20 years of reliable counsel, and Alessandro Romano had been with us for 4. Second, Carlo stopped. Second, because what I described was genuinely plausible. In our world, that kind of operation happens. People are turned. Documentation is manufactured. Vittorio had seen it happen to other organizations. He had no reason to think it couldn't happen to him. And Alessandro Romano had no chance to speak, Matteo said. He was removed before Vittorio would agree to hear him. I convinced Vittorio that allowing him to present his fabricated case would only give it a platform and create confusion. Carlo's voice was precise and completely empty of feeling. Alessandro Romano tried twice to reach Vittorio directly afterward. I intercepted both attempts. Vittorio died believing your father had been loyal, and Alessandro Romano had betrayed him. The room was silent. Isabella thought about the notebook entry dated 11 days before her father's removal. The entry where Alessandro Romano had written about the weight of truth, about patience, about faith, that what was real eventually found its level. He had written that entry knowing he was about to be removed and not fully understanding why, only understanding that the person he had trusted with the right information had been the wrong person to trust it with. He had never learned in his lifetime what Carlo had actually said to Vittorio. He had suspected in the later notebooks that a specific construction had been used against him, but he had not known the precise shape of it. She was learning it now in his place. She kept her face composed. She kept her breathing even. She kept her pen moving across her notebook because she was not going to sit in this room listening to the architecture of her father's destruction and not record every detail of it with the same care he had used to record what he had witnessed. The money, Matteo said. Where does it sit now? Various structures. Some has been reinvested into the organization over the years. The organization benefited from it indirectly, which is one reason the external accounts appear clean. Some remains in separate holdings. I want a complete accounting. Rinaldi will need. I want it from you. Directly. Not through Rinaldi, not through anyone else. You built the structure. You document the structure. Matteo's voice was still quiet, still controlled. You are going to spend the next several weeks showing me exactly what exists, and where it is, and how it connects to what should be in the organization's legitimate accounts. Carlo nodded. And then we'll determine what restitution looks like. For the organization. For the families of people who were affected. Matteo paused. For Alessandro Romano's estate. Carlo looked at Isabella. That would be you, he said. I don't want money, she said. It was the first thing she had said in over an hour. My father didn't do what he did for money. He did it because he believed in the truth of what he'd found and in the man he was working for. The only restitution that would have mattered to him was Vittorio Belandi knowing that his trust was correctly placed. She paused. That's not possible anymore, but his son can know it. Carlo looked at Matteo. Something moved between them, something complex and layered, and she understood she was not meant to fully parse it. The specific grief of a relationship that had been real in some dimension even while being built on a lie. I did love your father, Carlo said, quietly. The first thing he had said that sounded like something other than a statement of organizational fact. That is also true. Matteo looked at him for a long moment. I believe you, he said. I think you loved him, and I think you spent 30 years stealing from him and deceiving him and letting him go to his grave, proud of something that was rotten underneath. And I think you told yourself those two things were compatible. He paused, I've been trying to understand over the last 48 hours how a person holds those two things at the same time. I haven't managed it yet. Carlo had no answer for that. There wasn't one. By 3 in the afternoon, the outline of a process had been established. Carlo would provide a full accounting. The audit team would verify it. Matteo's legal advisors a separate set from the organization's normal counsel, because the normal counsel operated too close to Carlo's sphere of influence, would determine what the accounting revealed about the organization's current position and what remediation looked like. Carlo was escorted from the building by 2 men who were not security. In the traditional sense, they were members of Matteo's personal staff people whose loyalty Matteo had verified personally over years without understanding why he was being so particular about it. He understood now. Somewhere in him, underneath the conscious operation of his intelligence, something had known that the time would come when he needed to be certain of the people closest to him. When the room was empty except for the 2 of them, Matteo sat down for the first time in 3 hours. He sat in the chair across from Isabella's, and he put his elbows on the table, and he was quiet for a long moment. Not performing anything, not organizing the next decision. Just sitting with the weight of an afternoon that had dismantled the central architecture of his understanding of his own life. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned a long time ago that the most respectful thing you could offer someone carrying something heavy was not commentary, but presence. After a while, he said, "My father's name." "What about it?" He spent his whole life building something and trying to build it honestly. And the story that's been told inside this organization since his death, the story Carlo told, the version Carlo shaped, has him as a man who built power through whatever means were available. A man who was effective because he was ruthless. He looked at the window. That's not who he was trying to be. "No," she said. "It isn't. My father wrote about that, about how clearly Vittorio communicated what he wanted his organization to become. About how the Marseille deal represented for your father proof that the direction he was choosing was viable." She paused. He was right, by the way. The direction was viable. It was Carlo who made it impossible, not the direction itself. Matteo looked at her. "Your father gave him a lot of credit. My father was honest," she said. "When he thought well of someone, he wrote it. When he thought poorly of someone, he wrote that too." She smiled slightly, the first time she had smiled in hours. "You appear in the notebooks too, in the later ones after he'd been removed. He wrote about meeting you once briefly at an event in Naples. You were maybe 25. Matteo blinked. "I don't remember that." "You wouldn't. You were being introduced to someone else and my father was across the room. He just watched you for a few minutes." She looked at her transcription. "He wrote, Vittorio's son has his father's directness. He looks at things straight. That quality can be cultivated, or it can be broken. I hope the people around him know the difference." The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier silences. Matteo looked at the transcription page she was indicating, even though he couldn't read the shorthand. "He wrote that about me," he said. "He wrote that about you. He never met me properly. I didn't know who he was. No. But he knew who you were. He'd spent years watching your father. He recognized the directness." She set the notebook down. "He spent his last years hoping that quality wouldn't be broken, that whoever was around you when you came into your authority wasn't destroying it." "Carlo was around me," Matteo said. "Yes. Carlo spent 20 years trying to teach me that directness was a vulnerability, that seeing things straight was less important than seeing things strategically." His voice was very careful now. "He didn't entirely succeed, but he moved me further in that direction than I understood." "You saw this clearly," she said. "When you had the right information, you followed it directly. You didn't rationalize. You didn't find a way to avoid what the evidence showed." She paused. "My father would have recognized that." Matteo looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was open, in a way she had not seen it be open before, not vulnerable in the way that suggested weakness, but open in the way that suggested the interior of a person, the part that existed before the reputation and the authority, and the 20 years of learning to project both. "I mocked you," he said, across that table, in Sicilian. I said something dismissive, and I expected you to not understand it, and I thought that was a reasonable thing to do to a person I didn't know. Yes, she said. You did. I had no reason to do that beyond the assumption that you were beneath my attention. He held her gaze. My uncle taught me that, among other things. He spent 20 years teaching me that certain people were worth less attention than others, that someone in your position at that table was furniture, essentially. A lot of people believe that, she said, not just people Carlo taught. I know, that's what made it easy not to question. He paused. Your answer that night. In Sicilian. You didn't just correct me, you revealed that you understood not just the words but the whole structure of what I'd said, the assumption underneath the words, the tradition inside the language itself. He paused. That was what Carlo heard. That was why he warned you the same night. He heard that I was someone who understood more than I was supposed to, she said. He heard that you were dangerous, Matteo said. To him specifically, because someone who can hear what language remembers the way your father described it. Someone with that skill who also happened to be Alessandro Romano's daughter. That was the specific combination Carlo had been hoping to never encounter. He almost didn't, she said. I almost didn't open the boxes. Matteo looked at her. What made you open them? She thought about it. She thought about the card from the estate arriving on a Tuesday. The professional question of whether to take the assignment. The conversation with Francesca. The storage room the 2 times she had moved the boxes without opening them, the specific quality of the moment on Sunday night when she had understood that the time was ending. My father believed in finishing things, she said. He taught me that. He also taught me that some things can't be finished until the right moment arrives, and the skill is recognizing the moment. She looked at Matteo. When your invitation arrived, it was the most direct signal I'd ever received that the moment was now. I invited you to finish your father's work, Matteo said. He said it with the slight edge of someone absorbing an irony. You invited me because I answered you in Sicilian, she said. Because you were curious about the woman who knew a language you thought belonged to you. She paused. My father would have appreciated the mechanism. Truth finding its way through curiosity rather than through force. Matteo said nothing for a moment. Then he said, The organization is going to change. She nodded. She had expected this. The people Carlo cultivated, the ones inside the obligation network, they're going to be identified in the accounting process. Some of them will need to be removed. Some of them will need to be given the chance to operate differently depending on the nature of their involvement. His voice was moving back toward the decision-making register, not because he was retreating from the personal, but because in him, she was beginning to understand the personal and the organizational were not as separate as they were in most people. What he believed, and how he acted, were at the core the same operation. The partnerships that were built on dishonest foundations are going to need to be renegotiated or ended. That's going to create instability in the short term. I know. The Marseille situation specifically is going to require... He stopped. He exhaled slowly. Significant work. Legal, financial, relational. It's not a simple correction. No, she agreed. Some of the people who trusted this organization trusted my father's name. They made decisions based on what they believed this organization was. They deserve to know if what they believed was accurate. That's going to take courage, she said. Going to those people and telling them the truth. Yes, he said simply. It is. He looked at her. Will you help with that? The translation work, the international partners, the French group, the others. They're going to need to hear an accurate account of what happened and what the organization is going to do about it. I need someone who can... I'll help, she said. Before he finished the sentence, he stopped. He looked at her with an expression that held, she thought, more than one thing at once, relief and something adjacent to gratitude, and something else that was more careful than either of those, something that was still figuring out what shape it was going to take. You have no obligation to this organization, he said. I have an obligation to my father's work, she said, and his work was about telling the truth in the right place at the right time. She picked up her pen and returned her gaze to the transcription. This is the right place. This is the right time. Matteo stood. He straightened his jacket, the automatic gesture of a man reassembling the exterior of himself after something interior had been reorganized. At the door he stopped. "The man who mocked you across that table," he said. "I want to be direct with you about something." She looked up. "He was wrong about more than the language," Matteo said. "He was wrong about what value looked like and where it lived, and how to recognize it when it was standing in front of him." His voice was precise, direct, the quality her father had noted in a 25-year-old across a room in Naples. "I'm aware that saying that now, after the fact, is the least impressive version of that recognition. I'm saying it anyway, because I want you to know that I'm aware of the distance between what I assumed and what was true." Isabella looked at him for a moment. She thought about her father's notebooks, about patience and weight and faith, that the truth eventually found its level. "My father used to say," she said carefully, "that it wasn't the mistake that defined a person. It was what they did with the moment when they understood they'd made one." Matteo held her gaze. Then he nodded once. He left. Isabella looked at the documents on the table, at the organized timeline her father had spent years building, at the photographs of the 2003 memorandum sitting at the center of the pile, a piece of paper that a man had written and signed 3 decades ago, in the certainty that its context would never exist. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. Because the work was not finished yet, the accounting still needed to be documented. The international partners still needed to hear the truth. The full record of what Alessandro Romano had built and what it had cost him and what it had ultimately accomplished still needed to be completed. She was her father's daughter. She would finish what he had started. And outside the building, in the ordinary Saturday afternoon of Naples, the city continued its ancient, complicated, honest business of being exactly what it was. Not the story anyone had constructed about it, but the real thing, permanent and impervious, and carrying in its stones and its language and its memory everything that had ever been true inside it. Truth had weight. It always found its level. Alessandro Romano had believed that his entire life. His daughter was about to prove it. The accounting took 11 days. 11 days of Carlo Bellondi sitting across from Matteo's legal team in a room on the 2nd floor, not the secure room, not Matteo's office, a neutral room with no history, working through the structure of what he had built with the methodical precision of a man who had organized it and therefore knew exactly where everything was. He answered questions directly. He produced documentation when asked. He explained mechanisms when the legal team needed context. He did all of this without theatrics and without apparent remorse, which initially struck Rinaldi as sociopathic, and which Isabella, when Rinaldi mentioned it to her, thought was probably more accurately described as the behavior of a man who had made peace long ago with what he was, and who saw no utility in performing feelings he didn't have access to in the moment they would have needed to be genuine. She was not in the accounting sessions. Matteo had not asked her to be, and she had not offered. Her role in that room had been completed on the Saturday when she had laid out the documentation, and Carlo had confirmed it. What happened in the legal sessions afterward was the organization's internal work, the work of a structure examining itself and determining what it contained. That was Matteo's responsibility, not hers. Her work during those 11 days was different. Matteo had asked her to prepare for the international partners. There were 7 of them. The French investment group was the largest, but there were also partners in Spain, Germany, and 2 in the United Kingdom, who had active agreements with the Bellondi organization that touched in various ways on the period when Carlo's structure had been operating. Some of them knew something was wrong. They had sensed it the way experienced business people sense instability, not through specific information, but through the accumulation of small signals, slight inconsistencies in documentation, the occasional answer that was slightly too smooth. Others were genuinely unaware and would receive what Matteo was going to tell them as a complete surprise. She spent the 11 days building individual briefing documents for each partner, not translations in the traditional sense, but something more complex. She was translating the situation, taking the specific legal and financial reality that the accounting was uncovering and rendering it in language that each partner's cultural context, professional background, and specific relationship with the organization would allow them to hear accurately. Because the truth of what had happened was the same for all of them. But the way human beings received truth was never identical, and a version that landed clearly in Paris would land differently in Hamburg, and differently again in London. And Matteo needed all of them to understand, not just to receive words. On the fourth day, Greco, the auditor from the Saturday meeting, came to find her in the conference room where she was working. "The accounting is moving faster than expected," Greco said. She sat across from Isabella with the particular economy of movement of someone who never did anything without a purpose. "Carlo is being cooperative in a way that's almost unusual. He's not fighting anything." "He understands the situation," Isabella said. "He understands the situation," Greco agreed. "But most people in his situation still fight. Instinct, ego, the basic human resistance to surrender." She paused. "Carlo isn't fighting because he's already decided what he wants to preserve." Isabella looked up from her work. "He wants to preserve Matteo's ability to manage this," Greco said. "Whatever Carlo did, whatever his motivations were, and I've been sitting across from him for 4 days, and I'm still not entirely certain what they were, he doesn't want Matteo destroyed by it. He's being cooperative because he thinks his cooperation gives Matteo the best chance of controlling the outcome." Isabella set down her pen. "He still thinks he can manage something. He thinks his cooperation is a gift to his nephew. Whether Matteo receives it that way is a different question." Greco paused. "I thought you should know because you're building the partner communications, and the story of how this organization is telling the truth matters as much as the truth itself. If Carlo's cooperation is part of the story, it's not the part that matters," Isabella said. "The part that matters is that Matteo pulled the records himself, that Matteo convened the audit, that Matteo called the partners before they called him." She looked at Greco. "The cooperation is Carlo's. The decision to tell the truth is Matteo's. Those are not the same story." Greco studied her for a moment. "You understand how these things work," she said. "Not as a compliment exactly, as an observation." "My father taught me," Isabella said. "He spent 20 years thinking about the difference between who controls the information and who controls the meaning of the information." She picked up her pen again. "Carlo can cooperate with the accounting. He doesn't get to write the meaning of it." Greco nodded once. She left. Isabella went back to the German partner briefing. On the 7th day, Matteo called her into his office. He was standing when she arrived, which she had learned meant he was between decisions not settled into one, yet still moving through the options. He gestured to the chair across the desk, and this time he sat behind the desk, which also told her something. He was in the organizational register today, not the personal one. "The French group wants to meet in person," he said. "Gautier specifically. He's been patient. He received my preliminary communication 4 days ago, and he's waited, which is either professional courtesy or he's been consulting his own lawyers, and I suspect both." He paused. "I want you in that meeting." "Of course. Not as a translator, as the person who can explain the documentation context." He looked at her directly. "Gautier is going to have questions that go beyond what the official communication covers. He's going to want to understand how this was discovered. He's going to ask about the reliability of the internal audit. He may ask about the source of the original evidence." He paused. "I want him to meet you." She understood what he was not saying. He wanted Gautier to understand that the truth had come through someone independent, not through Matteo's lawyers, not through the organization's internal process alone, but through a person with no organizational interest in protecting the Belandi name. Gautier, knowing that Isabella was Alessandro Romano's daughter, that her father had documented this from inside the organization and been removed for it, that the documentation had survived for 20 years and had finally been brought to the right place. That story made the truth more credible, not just more sympathetic. More credible structurally, because it demonstrated the evidence existed outside the organization's control. "When is the meeting?" she asked. "Thursday, Paris." He paused. "Will you travel?" "Yes." He nodded. He looked at the papers on his desk for a moment. "The accounting is close to complete. The total financial figure is significant. More than I expected, which means either Carlo was more successful at concealment than I understood, or he'd been doing this for longer than the documents your father preserved directly indicated." "My father's records go back to 2001, she said. "Carlo started in the early 1990s. "We found evidence going back to 1993, Matteo confirmed, "before my father fully consolidated the organization. When he was still building, still vulnerable to the kind of internal diversions that were easier to conceal because the structure was less defined. He built the infrastructure for it before the organization was solid enough to audit it properly," Isabella said. "Then by the time the organization had the structure to notice, Carlo was managing the audit process." "Yes." Matteo was quiet for a moment. "There's something I haven't told you yet." She waited. "In the 1993 records, the earliest ones we've found, there's a transaction that appears to have been the first time Carlo diverted funds outside the organization's legitimate accounts." He looked at her. "It corresponds to a period my father was dealing with a significant external threat, a competing organization trying to take territory in the South. He was under enormous pressure. He needed money quickly for certain arrangements. Carlo told him the money came from a reserve account my father didn't regularly access." He paused. "It didn't. It came from the first use of the mechanism Carlo was building." Isabella absorbed this. "Carlo's first move was to help your father survive a crisis. Using money Carlo had already begun diverting for his own purposes. He used his own theft to fund my father's defense." Matteo's voice was precise and strange. "Which meant that my father's survival of that crisis was partly dependent on Carlo's dishonesty. Which meant my father was indebted to Carlo for something he didn't understand was a manipulation." He looked at the desk. "Carlo didn't just steal from my father. He made my father dependent on the theft without my father knowing it existed." The room was very quiet. "He was very thorough," Isabella said finally. "He was brilliant," Matteo said. "I want to be able to hate him simply, and I can't, because what he built was genuinely brilliant. It's one of the most sophisticated internal financial structures I've ever seen, and I've seen things." He looked up. "I can hate what he did, but I can't pretend it wasn't done by an intelligent person who understood exactly what he was building." "My father wrote something similar," she said. "Not about the financial structure specifically, he didn't know the full extent of it, but about Carlo as a person. He wrote that Carlo Belandi was one of the most capable people he had ever encountered, and that this made what Carlo did to the organization worse rather than better, because it meant the damage was intentional and precise, not opportunistic, designed." Matteo looked at her. "Your father understood him." "My father understood most people," she said. "It was his gift and his problem. He understood Carlo clearly enough to see what he was doing. He just didn't understand how completely Carlo had already understood him in return." She paused. "Carlo knew my father would go to him first. He knew my father trusted him. He knew exactly how my father processed information and what he would need before he felt certain enough to bring something to Vittorio. He had that information because he'd spent years watching my father work." She paused. "He used my father's own analytical method against him." Matteo was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to make sure the record reflects what Alessandro Romano actually did, not just internally publicly to the extent that can be managed. His reputation was destroyed deliberately. What can be restored should be." She felt something move through her that she hadn't been prepared for, not the emotional weight of grief which she had been carrying in a manageable form for most of the past 3 weeks, but something different. Something that felt like the completion of a circuit. The specific sensation of something that had been broken for a long time, finding its other half. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. "It's not enough," he said. "I know that. It doesn't restore what he lost. But it's accurate, and accurate is the least that's owed to him." She nodded. She picked up her portfolio. She went back to work. The Paris meeting was on a gray Thursday morning in a conference room on the top floor of a building in the 8th arrondissement that Gautier's group used for formal meetings. The room held 8 people, total. Gautier and 3 colleagues on one side, Matteo and 2 of his legal advisors on the other. Isabella at the end of the table where she could address either side without appearing to take a position. Gautier was in his early 60s, compact and precise, with the manner of a man who had conducted enough high-stakes negotiations to have stripped them down to the essentials. He greeted Matteo correctly and looked at Isabella with an attention that told her he had researched her since receiving Matteo's communication. "Mademoiselle Romano," he said, in French with a deliberate formality. "I understand you are the source of the original documentation that initiated this process." "The documentation originated with my father," she said, in French. "I located it, translated it, and brought it to Mr. Belandi's attention." "Your father worked with the Belandi organization in the early 2000s. "He did. He was removed from that position in 2003 under false pretenses after discovering the financial irregularities that the current audit has confirmed." Gautier looked at Matteo. "You were unaware of this." "I was unaware," Matteo said. "The individual responsible for the misconduct also managed the information my father and I had access to regarding that period. The removal of Alessandro Romano was presented to my father as a necessary action against an untrustworthy employee. I had no reason to question it because I wasn't in a position of authority at that time, and the person who managed the explanation was the same person who created the situation that required explanation." Gautier absorbed this. "Your uncle." "My uncle." "Who is currently cooperating with your internal audit." "Who is cooperating fully." Gautier turned to his colleagues for a brief quiet exchange in French that Isabella followed without appearing to. One of them asked whether the internal audit's independence could be verified. Another noted that the original documentation, the Romano notebooks, were a private source that could theoretically have been altered. The third said something about the 2003 memorandum, specifically whether its authenticity could be established through handwriting or document forensics. Gautier looked back at Matteo. "The concern my colleagues are raising is not about your good faith," he said carefully. "It's about the verification of documentation that emerged from a private source." "I understand," Matteo said, "which is why I'm proposing an independent third-party verification process, an external forensic accounting firm, not one with prior relationships with this organization, to examine both the original archive documents and the audit findings, and produce an independent report." He slid a folder across the table. "I've outlined the proposed structure here. The cost is borne by this organization. The firm is selected jointly by your legal advisors and mine. They have unrestricted access to the relevant records." Gautier opened the folder. He read for 2 minutes in silence. Then he said, "This is more than we asked for." "I know," Matteo said. "It's what the situation requires." One of Gautier's colleagues leaned forward. "Mr. Belandi, I want to ask you directly. The partnership agreement your group and our investment consortium signed in 2019. Does the misconduct your audit has uncovered touch that agreement in any way?" "No," Matteo said. "The misconduct was entirely historical. The structure was built between 1993 and 2006, and Carlo Belandi's active role in the organization ended significantly before 2019. The 2019 agreement was clean." He paused. "However, the fact that it was clean doesn't change your right to know the full picture of the organization you've been partnering with. You made decisions in 2019 based on your assessment of this organization. You deserve to make those assessments with accurate information." Gautier set the folder down. He looked at Matteo for a long moment with the specific attention of someone making a final calibration. "You didn't have to initiate this disclosure," Gautier said. "The irregularities were historical. The ongoing partnership wasn't affected. You could have handled this internally, and we would never have known." "Yes," Matteo said. "Why didn't you?" Mateo was quiet for a moment. He glanced briefly at Isabella. She kept her expression neutral, but she noticed. Because my father built this organization with the intention of making it something honest, Mateo said. And I spent 20 years believing I was honoring that intention while working with someone who was systematically undermining it without my knowledge. I'm not able to honor my father's intention by staying quiet about what was done to it. He paused. And because the people in this room made decisions based on their assessment of this organization's integrity. Integrity means the outside matches the inside. I want it to match. The room was very still. Then Gautier did something Isabella hadn't seen him do in the 90 minutes they had been in the room together. He sat back in his chair. He let the formal precision of his posture relax by approximately 3 degrees, which on him was the equivalent of someone else removing their jacket. The external audit process is acceptable, he said. We'll have our legal team contact yours by end of week regarding firm selection. He looked at Isabella. Your father's documentation, the original notebooks. Are they available for forensic verification if needed? Yes, she said. They're fully available. My father intended them to be used. Gautier nodded. He looked at his colleagues. Something passed between them. The efficient nonverbal shorthand of people who have worked together long enough to have condensed entire conversations into a look. We will not be terminating the partnership agreement, Gautier said. He addressed Mateo directly. What you've done today is not what we expected. It is what integrity looks like when it's actually present, rather than merely performed. He paused. That is more valuable to us than the specific financial details of what your organization went through 30 years ago. Mateo said, thank you. Simple. Without the architecture of authority. Just 2 words. On the way out of this building, Gautier fell into step beside Isabella briefly slightly ahead of the others. Your French is remarkable, he said in French, quietly. My father thought every language deserved to be spoken properly, she said. He was right. Gautier paused at the door. He sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was, she said. He believed in things that were inconvenient to believe in. He paid for it, and he kept believing them anyway. Gautier looked at her for a moment. That is either the definition of a fool or the definition of someone genuinely courageous. I've spent 60 years not being entirely sure which. He opened the door. I think in your father's case it may have been the second thing. He left. She stood in the doorway for a moment in the gray Paris morning and let herself feel for just a few seconds the full weight of what her father had carried and what it had cost him and what it had finally 20 years late managed to accomplish. Then she went to find Mateo. They flew back to Naples that evening. On the plane, Mateo worked through the contents of a folder for the first hour. Isabella read. The silence between them was the comfortable kind 2 people who had been through something difficult together and had arrived at the other side and were simply existing in the same space without needing to fill it. An hour into the flight, Mateo closed the folder. The German partners called while we were in the meeting, he said. Rinaldi texted me. They want to meet next week. I have their briefing ready, she said. The UK group has been quiet. The UK group is always quiet first, she said. They're thinking. Quiet doesn't mean hostile. It usually means they're being careful about their response. They'll reach out by the end of the week. He looked at her. How do you know that? I've been working with international partners for 6 years. British professional culture tends toward deliberate process. They want to have thought through every question before they ask any of them. She paused. Also, the specific contact at the UK group, the one in my briefing research Hargrove, he's a former barrister. He thinks in sequences. He'll want to have the complete picture before he opens communication. Mateo studied her. You researched the individual people. Of course. You can't translate a situation without understanding who's receiving it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been thinking about something you said in the accounting sessions. When Carlo was talking about the 1993 transaction, the first one, and you said he was brilliant. I said the structure was brilliant, she corrected. There's a difference. Is there a brilliant structure built by a person doesn't make the person admirable. It makes the waste greater. She looked at the seat back in front of her. Carlo had the capacity to build something extraordinary honestly. He chose to use it to build something that served only himself. That's not brilliance worth respecting. It's intelligence put in the service of the wrong thing. She paused. My father was not as obviously talented at organizational strategy, but he put what he had in the service of something worth serving. That's worth more. Matteo was quiet for a long moment. The organization, he said. What it's going to look like on the other side of this. I've been thinking about it. He paused. There are members of the family structure people who have been part of how this operates for years, who knew nothing about what Carlo was doing, who have operated in good faith for decades inside a system that had something corrupt at its center without their knowledge. He looked at the folder in his hands. They deserve to know the truth as much as the external partners do. Yes, she said. And there are people who were inside Carlo's network. Some of them under coercion. He cultivated obligation rather than genuine loyalty, which means some of them cooperated because they felt they had no choice. Those people are different from the ones who chose it. You're thinking about how to distinguish between them, she said. I'm thinking about how to build something that doesn't require people to be afraid of the person above them. He said it plainly. Carlo built a loyalty network through obligation and fear. My father tried to build something different. I spent 20 years building something that I thought was closer to my father's model, but Carlo was shaping my understanding of what that model looked like. He paused. I don't know how much of what I've built is actually my father's intention, and how much is Carlo's version of it. Then find out, she said. He looked at her. Ask the people around you the things Carlo would never have let you ask them, she said. Ask them what they're afraid of. Ask them what they've never been able to say. Ask them what they believe the organization should be, and compare it to what it is. She paused. You'll find out very quickly which parts of what you've built match your father's intention, and which parts are Carlo's architecture. Matteo looked at her for a moment. That's a significant process. Yes, she said. It is. It's also the only way to know. He was quiet for a while. The plane moved through the night above the Alps. Isabella. He used her name without the professional distance again. She had stopped noting it each time it had become simply how he addressed her. After this is done, after the accounting is finalized and the partners have been briefed and the internal process is complete, what are you going to do? She hadn't thought past it. She had been so focused on the work, her father's work, the notebooks, the documentation, the briefings, the Paris meeting, that the question of what existed on the other side of completion had not fully formed. Go back to Palermo, probably, she said. Resume my regular clients. The work doesn't stop because one assignment was larger than usual. I'd like to offer you something, he said. Not as a consulting engagement, something more permanent. He paused. The organization is going to need a function it's never had before, a formal international liaison role. Someone who manages communication with our external partners with the specific combination of language skill and cultural translation you've been providing. He paused. Someone who understands that what people say and what they mean are different problems, and who has the patience to work in the space between them. She looked at him. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a position that didn't exist before you demonstrated that it needed to exist, he said. Which is different. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about the canvas bag with the notebook inside it that she had carried to his office on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks ago. She thought about her father's boxes and the work of translating everything in them and what it had led to. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. He picked up the folder again. Then, without looking up, you told Gautier your father believed things that were inconvenient to believe, things it cost him to keep believing. Yes. What did he believe specifically? She thought about the notebooks, about the specific passages she had read the most times the ones she had sat with longest. He believed that honesty had structural integrity, she said. that a life or an organization built on truth was stronger than one built on construction, even if the construction appeared more stable in the short term. He believed that the strength of a true thing was that it didn't require maintenance. You didn't have to remember what you'd said or manage what people knew or control the flow of information. The true thing just continued to be true. She paused. And he believed that the people who understood this were worth finding and protecting, because there weren't as many of them as you'd hope. Matteo didn't respond immediately. He turned a page in the folder. Then he said very quietly, "He was right." She looked at him. He was reading. His face was in the organizational register again, the focused, forward-facing attention of a man processing information. But there was something in the set of his shoulders that had been different for the past several days. Something had loosened. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would be visible to people who hadn't been watching closely. But she had been watching closely for 3 weeks, and she could see it. The man across the dinner table 3 weeks ago had been armored in a very specific way, armored by 20 years of learning that authority was the most reliable protection available. That man had mocked a woman in Sicilian because mocking was a form of authority, and the assumption of incomprehension was a form of control. The man on this plane was still that man in every external way. Same voice, same directness, same quality of absolute attention when he decided something deserved it. But the armor had changed, not removed. She didn't romanticize what 3 weeks of truth-telling could accomplish, but recalibrated, adjusted to a different understanding of what actually needed protecting and what the protection was for. She went back to her reading. The plane descended toward Naples an hour later, through a clear dark sky that held below it the lights of a city that had been built over centuries on the understanding that power was real and that its shape changed, and that occasionally, if you were paying close enough attention at the right moment, you could be present for the change. She was paying attention. She had always paid attention. It was the thing her father had given her that couldn't be taken. The week that followed was the organizational week, the one that would determine the shape of what came after. Matteo called 3 internal meetings of the key family members and senior staff. Isabella was not in those meetings. She was aware of them peripherally, aware of the tension in the building, the way people in the corridors were slightly more careful with their words, the way Rinaldi moved with the suppressed energy of someone managing more information than usual. On the Wednesday of that week, she was working in the conference room when the door opened and a man she had seen once before walked in. He was in his mid-50s, with the look of someone who had spent a long time making himself easy to overlook. He introduced himself as Donato No Last Name, and said that he had been with the organization for 22 years and that he had been part of Carlo Belandi's network. Isabella set down her pen. "I'm not a legal advisor," she said carefully. "If you want to make a statement about your involvement." "I know you're not a lawyer," Donato said. He stood near the door, not advancing further into the room. "I wanted to talk to Alessandro Romano's daughter, specifically." He paused. "I knew your father, briefly. In 2003, I was one of the people Carlo used to make sure Alessandro Romano's second attempt to reach Vittorio Belandi didn't succeed." The room was very quiet. She looked at him. He was not trying to perform contrition. He had the look of a man who had been carrying something specific for a long time and had decided in the wake of the current week that the weight of it was greater than whatever it cost to set it down. "What did you do?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was an opening, he told her. It was not dramatic. The act itself had been ordinary in the way that all the small components of large betrayals are ordinary. He had intercepted a phone call. He had passed the information to Carlo. He had told himself it was organizational loyalty, which was what Carlo had always called it when he asked people to do things they knew were wrong. "I've told this to Mr. Belandi's legal team already," Donato said. "It's in the accounting process. I'm not here to confess to you. I've already done that in the appropriate place." He paused. "I wanted to tell you because you're the one who came here carrying what your father built. You should know that the night Carlo had the second call intercepted, your father left a message for Vittorio. Carlo made sure Vittorio never heard it, but I heard it." He paused. Alessandro Romano said in the message that he wasn't trying to damage the organization, that everything he had found because he was trying to protect the organization for Vittorio's son. That whoever ran this organization after Vittorio, he wanted it to be built on something real. Isabella did not look away. "He said he was doing it for the son," Donato said quietly. "Not for Vittorio." At this point, he knew Vittorio was past convincing. He said he was doing it for the boy who was going to inherit this because the boy deserved to inherit something honest. She breathed carefully. "The boy who inherited it," she said, "was 23 years old when he received it." Yes, and he spent 20 more years inside a structure that Carlo had built without knowing that the person who built it had been the specific target of his father's most important colleague's final attempt at honesty. Yes. She looked at Donato for a moment. She thought about Matteo on the plane saying he was right. She thought about her father at 61 years old ill and patient still finishing something he believed needed to be finished. Still thinking about the son. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She meant it. Donato nodded. He left. She sat with it for a while. Then she picked up her phone and called Matteo. He answered on the second ring. "There's something you need to know," she said, "about your father's organization and about what mine was trying to do with it." She paused. "And about you specifically. What he thought about you specifically." She paused. "Can we talk this evening?" A brief silence. "Yes," he said. "Where?" She thought about it. "Somewhere that isn't this building," she said. "Somewhere ordinary." Another pause. Then, "I know a place. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, she agreed. She hung up. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at the photographs of the 2003 memorandum still sitting where she had placed them 3 weeks ago. She looked at her father's transcription pages, organized and complete and clear. She thought about a man who had spent the last years of his life building something for a 23-year-old he had never properly met because he believed that boy deserved to inherit something honest. She thought about the fact that the boy was now 42, that it had taken 20 years, that her father had not been wrong about the worth of waiting. She gathered her things and went to meet him. Outside, the city was doing what cities do at the end of the day, filling with the ordinary sounds of people moving from one part of their lives to another, carrying what they needed, leaving behind what they could afford, to holding on to the things that mattered in ways they didn't always have names for. Truth had weight. It always found its level. It had taken 20 years and 3 boxes in a storage room and a dinner table in Sicilian and 11 days of accounting and a gray morning in Paris. But Alessandro Romano's work had found the person it was built for. And that person was ready finally to receive it. The restaurant Matteo chose was nothing like the Belandi estate. No marble table. No candles arranged for atmosphere. No men in dark suits measuring the room from the perimeter. It was a small place in the Quartieri Spagnoli. 12 tables, a menu written on a chalkboard that changed based on what the owner had found at the market that morning. The kind of place that had been in the same family for 3 generations and showed it in the good way, in the way of walls that had absorbed decades of meals and voices and the ordinary warmth of people eating together. Matteo was already there when Isabella arrived. He was at a corner table and he had ordered water and bread, and he was not on his phone, which she noticed because powerful people were almost always on their phones when they were made to wait for anything. He was simply sitting, waiting. The way a person waits when they have decided that what they are waiting for deserves their full attention. She sat across from him. A waiter came. They ordered without looking at the menu because neither of them was thinking about food in any serious way. And the waiter, who had the particular quality of someone who understood the difference between a dinner for pleasure and a dinner for conversation, brought wine and then left them alone. "Donato came to see me today," she said. Matteo nodded. "He told me he was going to. He told you about the message, the one my father left for Vittorio that Carlo had intercepted. He told me. Matteo turned his wine glass slightly on the table, not drinking it, just holding it in his hands the way you hold something when you need to do something with your hands while you think. Your father left a message for my father in the last week of October 2003. He said he wasn't trying to damage the organization. He said he was trying to protect it. He paused. For me. Yes. A man I never properly met, who had been inside my father's organization for 4 years, who was being removed under false accusations. He looked at the table. He spent his last breath of access to my family trying to protect someone he'd never spoken to. He had spoken to you, she said. Once. Briefly. You didn't know who he was. No. Matteo looked up. I've been trying to remember. An event in Naples 25 years ago. I was being introduced to someone I can't place it. He shook his head. I don't remember him. He remembered you, she said. He wrote about your directness, about the way you looked at things straight. She paused. He was worried about who was going to be around you when you came into your authority. He was worried they would break that quality. Matteo was quiet for a moment. Carlo didn't break it, he said. He redirected it. He taught me to use directness as a weapon to look at things straight in order to identify their vulnerabilities, to see clearly in order to control. He paused. Your father saw the quality before it was shaped by 20 years of Carlo's instruction. He saw what it could be before it became what Carlo needed it to be. And now you know the difference, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The restaurant around them was filling up voices movement. The ordinary evening sounds of a place that had been feeding people for 3 generations. None of it touched the particular quality of the space between them. He deserved better than what he got, Matteo said. He said it plainly, without the organizational precision and without the personal performance of emotion. Just a plain statement. Alessandro Romano deserved better than what my family, what Carlo gave him. Yes, she said. He did. What would have satisfied him if he could have known how this ended? What would have been enough? She thought about it. She thought about the notebooks, about the specific texture of her father's faith. Not naive faith. Not the faith of someone who didn't understand the difficulty of what he was asking the world to do, but the patient faith of someone who had looked clearly at how hard a thing was and decided it was worth waiting for anyway, knowing that Vittorio's son had the real story, she said. That's what the message to Vittorio was trying to give. Not revenge against Carlo, not money, not his reputation back, even though that mattered. Just someone in that family knowing what actually happened. Someone being able to make real decisions about what to build because they had accurate information about what existed. She paused. He thought the organization could be something honest if the right person was leading it with the right information. He spent 20 years believing that and keeping his documentation in the hope that the information would eventually reach the right person. It did, Matteo said. 20 years late, she said. 20 years late, he agreed. But it did. They sat with that for a moment. The wine remained untouched. The bread remained untouched. Sometimes a meal is not about eating. His reputation, Matteo said. I've spoken with the legal team about a formal public record, a statement from the organization acknowledging what happened in 2003, that Alessandro Romano was removed under false pretenses, that his concerns were accurate, and that the documentation he preserved was instrumental in uncovering the misconduct he identified. He paused. It won't restore everything. It won't give him back the years. But it will exist. People who knew him, people in this industry who knew his name and the version Carlo built of why he was removed, they'll have access to the accurate version. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She did it to have something to do with them. That matters, she said. That matters more than you probably know. I think I know, he said quietly. She looked up at him. I've been thinking, he said, about what it costs a person to carry an accurate version of something that the world has decided to call false. To know the truth about yourself, and to live inside a reality that's recorded an incorrect version of you. He paused. Your father did that for 20 years. He carried the accurate version of himself against the false version Carlo had published, and he kept working and kept documenting and kept believing that the weight of the truth would eventually be enough. Matteo's voice was careful and precise. That takes more strength than anything I was taught to call strength. Isabella said nothing. She was not going to cry in this restaurant, not because the feeling wasn't there, but because her father had been a composed man, and she had learned composure from him, and composure meant you felt things fully, and expressed them appropriately, not suppressed, just held correctly. "Can I show you something?" Matteo said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a photograph. He set it on the table between them. It was an old photograph. The quality of something taken in the 1990s, slightly faded, slightly overexposed in the way of photographs from before digital correction. Two men at what appeared to be a business dinner. One of them was younger than he appeared in later photographs Isabella had seen Vittorio Belandi in his late 40s, the physical resemblance to Matteo visible across the years. The other man was smaller, with the close handwriting and careful posture she recognized from the only photograph she had of her own father from that era, Alessandro Romano and Vittorio Belandi, together. She picked up the photograph. She looked at her father's face. He was smiling a real smile, the kind that reached everything, the kind she remembered from before he got sick, before the years of carrying the truth wore the lightness out of his expressions. "Where did you find this?" she said. "In my father's personal records, the ones Carlo didn't manage." He paused. "My father kept personal photographs separate from organizational files, in a box in his study that Carlo apparently never went through, or perhaps decided wasn't worth going through." He paused. "Rinaldi found it this week when we were going through non-organizational records as part of the accounting completeness check." She looked at the photograph for a long time, her father, smiling. In the time before everything went wrong, in the time when he was still inside the thing he believed in, working alongside the man he respected in the specific window when the honest version of the future was still possible. "He looks happy," she said. "He looks like someone who is exactly where they wanted to be," Matteo said. She set the photograph down carefully. She slid it back across the table toward Matteo. He shook his head. "That's for you," he said. "It belongs with you." She picked it up again. She held it. She did not say anything for a moment because there was a category of gratitude that was too large for immediate language, and she had learned from years of translation that the moment when language was insufficient was the moment to wait, rather than to fill the space with something smaller than what was needed. "Thank you," she said finally. "Keep it," he said simply. They finally ate. The conversation moved not away from what mattered, but through it and alongside it, the way conversation does when two people have been through something together and don't need to keep returning to it directly to keep carrying it. They talked about Gautier and the Paris meeting and what the German partners had said in their preliminary call. They talked about the internal organizational meetings and which people had surprised Matteo and which had confirmed what he already suspected. They talked about the accounting process and where it was heading, and at some point, without either of them marking it as a transition, they talked about other things. About Palermo and Naples and the specific character of Sicilian dialect versus Neapolitan, and why certain words survived in one and not the other. About her grandmother, who had spoken nothing but the old language, and what it had been like to grow up in a house where the old language was as natural as breathing. About Matteo's father in the specific personal way that had been impossible to talk about in the building in the organizational context, not as a legacy or an inheritance or a symbol, but as a person, a man, someone who had apparently made excellent coffee and had terrible taste in music and had once spent an entire Sunday afternoon trying to teach a young Matteo to cook something he had no patience for learning. They left the restaurant at 10:30. The street outside was quieter than it had been the evening winding down the city, settling into its later self. They stood on the street for a moment. "The position," Matteo said. "The one I mentioned on the plane. Have you thought about it?" "I've thought about it," she said. And she looked at the street. She thought about Palermo and her apartment and her regular clients and the work she went back to between assignments, the steady professional life she had built. She thought about what the past 3 weeks had been, the intensity of it, the weight of it, the specific quality of work that mattered in a way that most work didn't, because the stakes were real and the outcome was uncertain, and the person at the center of it needed to actually understand the truth rather than just receive it. "I want to understand what the position actually is," she said, "not the title. What it would require day to day, what decisions I would have authority to make, what access I would have to the information I'd need to do it properly." She looked at him. "I'm not going to take a position that sounds significant and turns out to be ornamental." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a spontaneous smile she had seen from him. "It would not be ornamental," he said. "If I wanted ornamental, I would hire someone who was impressed by the office and the title and would perform the role without actually changing anything." He paused. "That's not what I'm offering you." "What are you offering me?" "I'm offering you a place in the organization that has real function and real authority," he said. "International relationships managed by someone who understands the space between what people say and what they mean. Who can hear what the other side of a negotiation actually needs, rather than only what they're asking for? Who can be trusted to represent this organization to partners who are now evaluating us very carefully because of what this month has revealed, and who need to believe that what we're saying matches what we are?" He paused. "I can't hire that. I can only offer it to someone who already is it." She looked at him. "You're also offering it to someone who came into your organization with a hidden agenda," she said, "not accusatory factual. I accepted your consulting contract knowing I had my father's notebooks, knowing what was in them. I didn't disclose that when I accepted the position." "No," he said, "you didn't." "That's a form of concealment." "Yes." He held her gaze directly. "It's also what made it possible for the truth to get into this organization at all. If you had disclosed your father's connection when you accepted the position, Carlo would have been informed within 24 hours, and you would have been removed before anything could be examined." He paused. "You understood the room you were in before you stepped into it. You understood what the situation required, and you acted accordingly." He paused. "My father would have recognized that." She let that land. "I'll take the position," she said. Something settled in Matteo's face. Not relief exactly. Something more like a piece of a structure finding its correct place. "Good," he said. 3 months passed. The external forensic audit was completed in 6 weeks. Its findings confirmed everything the internal accounting had produced, which settled the remaining uncertainty among the international partners and allowed the relationship conversations to move from disclosure to reconstruction. Gautier's group signed a revised partnership agreement that incorporated new transparency protocols, a structure Isabella had helped draft working with both the Belandi legal team and Gautier's building. Something that neither side had initially proposed, but that emerged from the conversation when the right questions were asked in the right way. The German partners followed. The UK group Hargrove, the former barrister who had indeed waited 9 days before his first communication, and then asked 43 specific questions in a single very long email, took longer. But their eventual resolution was the most complete of any of the partnerships, because Hargrove was the kind of person who, once he decided something was trustworthy, trusted it entirely. Internally, the organization changed in ways that were gradual and real, rather than dramatic and performed. Matteo conducted individual meetings with every senior member of the family structure over a period of 6 weeks. He asked questions Carlo would not have approved of about what people were afraid to say, about where the organization's current practices didn't match the values it claimed, about what they thought should be different. He did not promise to implement everything he heard. He promised to hear it which was different, and in an organization that had operated under Carlo's information management for decades, was more significant. Several people left. 2 of them left because they had been deeply enough inside Carlo's network that remaining was not viable for anyone involved. The others left because the organization that was emerging was genuinely different from the one they had operated in, and different was not what they had signed on for. Several people who had been quiet for years became less quiet. There was a woman named Ferrara who managed the organization's legitimate real estate holdings and who had apparently been trying to raise concerns about certain documentation practices for 2 years before Matteo's organizational meetings. She sat across from him in one of those meetings and said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me this specific question for 24 months. Matteo listened to her for 3 hours. 3 of the practices she described were changed within a month. Isabella's role settled into a shape that was its own thing, not the role the title suggested, and not the role Matteo had described on the plane, but the specific role that emerged from doing the work and discovering what the work actually needed. She managed the international relationships. She drafted communications that required the particular skill of translating not just between languages, but between contexts. She sat in meetings where her function was not to speak, but to listen, to track what was not being said, to identify the gaps between what both sides wanted and what they were asking for, and to find her way afterward back to Matteo with the information that allowed him to see the full picture. She was good at it in the way that only happens when you have been building a skill your entire life without knowing exactly what it was being built for. On a Tuesday morning in the 4th month, she arrived at the building to find a formal envelope on her desk. Letterhead she didn't recognize. Legal firm in Palermo. She opened it. It was a notification of a public record filing. The Belandi organization, represented by its legal counsel, had formally submitted to the Palermo Commercial Registry a statement of record regarding Alessandro Romano, documenting his employment with the organization, the nature of his work, the accuracy of the concerns he had raised in 2003, the false pretenses under which he had been removed, and the organization's formal acknowledgement that the record established during his removal was incorrect, and that Alessandro Romano's professional conduct had been throughout his engagement with the Belandi organization exemplary. At the bottom of the document was a note from the legal team. This filing has been made as a matter of public record and will be accessible through the Palermo Commercial Registry. A certified copy is being sent to the professional associations of which Mr. Romano was a member at the time of his removal. She sat with the envelope in her hands for a moment. 23 years. Her father had carried the false version for 23 years. He had gone to his grave carrying it, and now the accurate version existed in writing in a public record in the city where he had lived and worked, and been called a liar by people with more power than him. She set the envelope down. She turned to her computer. She opened the document she had been working on, a communication framework for a new partnership inquiry that had arrived from a Swiss investment group, and she began to work. She worked for 45 minutes before Matteo appeared in the doorway. He looked at the envelope on her desk. He looked at her face. "You received it," he said. "This morning." He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her desk. Her desk, now a real desk in a real office, not the conference room or the secure room, but a permanent space that had her name on the door in the building directory. He sat with the same quality of presence that she had come to recognize as his version of care. Not demonstrative, not decorated with gestures that announced themselves, just fully there, fully attentive. "I should have told you it was coming," he said. "I wanted it to be complete before you saw it. The legal team finished the filing yesterday." "It's complete?" she said. Her voice was steady. "It's very complete." "Does it?" He paused. He was choosing his words with unusual care. "Is it what you hoped for when you started this? When you opened the boxes? Was this the version of the ending you were looking for?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about what she had been looking for when she sat on the floor of her storage room and opened the first box. She thought about the message her father had left for Vittorio, for the son, for the boy who was going to inherit this, and about what Alessandro Romano's real hope had been underneath the documentation and the methodology and the careful shorthand. "My father wasn't looking for a filing in a registry," she said. "He was looking for the truth to be received by the right person. He was looking for Vittorio Belandi's son to have accurate information about what his father actually built and what was done to it." She paused. That happened. That's the thing that mattered to him. She looked at the envelope. The filing matters to me. It's for the professional community that knew him, for the people who heard the wrong version and didn't have a way to correct it. She paused. It's for my father's name, which is also his, which is mine. I care about that. I care about it very much. She looked at Matteo. But it's not the center of what this was. What's the center? He asked. She looked at him. She thought about the dinner table 3 weeks ago, the organizational meetings, and the Paris morning, and the plane, and the photograph of her father smiling. She thought about Matteo saying he was right quietly, without any performance, meaning every word of it. The center, she said, is that the person my father was trying to protect received the protection, 20 years late, but received. Matteo held her gaze. Your father protected something I didn't know. I needed protecting, he said. He tried to give me an honest inheritance before I was old enough to receive it. And then he spent 20 years keeping it safe until the moment arrived. He paused. I think about that. I think about a man spending 20 years in a waiting room that had no guaranteed exit, maintaining faith that the door would eventually open. He was patient, she said. It was his most underrated quality. I'm learning patience, Matteo said. And the way he said it told her he didn't mean organizational patience, the strategic patience of a man who knew when to move and when to wait. He meant something more interior, the patience of a person learning to be in a process without needing to control its speed. It's harder than I expected. It usually is, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, there's something happening in 2 weeks. A gathering of the family, the extended family people who are connected to this organization by history and relationship, even if not by active role. We hold it every year. My father started it as a way of maintaining connection between the formal organizational structure and the people who were part of its history. He paused. I'd like you to be there, not in a professional capacity. As someone who is part of what this organization has become and part of what it's going to be. She understood the significance of what he was asking. In the world Matteo inhabited, the gatherings of the extended family were not social events in the ordinary sense. They were an expression of the organizational identity, who was inside, who was trusted, who had a place in the ongoing story of the family. Being invited was a statement. I'll be there, she said. Something in him settled again, the same quality she had noticed on the street outside the restaurant, a peace finding its place. There's one more thing, he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small card. He set it on her desk. The foundation documentation. Legal has it almost finalized. I wanted you to see the formal name before it goes public. She picked up the card. It was a draft heading for an organizational letterhead. The foundation name was in clean type at the top. The Alessandro Romano Foundation for Language and Cultural Education. Her hands were very still on the card. It will fund language training for young people from working-class backgrounds in Palermo and Naples, Matteo said. His voice was precise and careful. The focus on Sicilian dialect specifically programs that preserve and teach the regional language as a living thing, rather than an archival one. Your grandmother would have approved, I think. He paused. There will also be a scholarship program for young women specifically entering language and translation fields, named for him so that the professional community that knew him will encounter his name in connection with something active and forward-facing, rather than only in the correction of a historical wrong. She was not going to cry in this office either. She breathed. She set the card down on the desk. She aligned it with the corner of the desk because she needed something precise to do with her hands. He believed languages carried things that ordinary words couldn't hold, she said. Her voice was even. He believed that was worth teaching. I know, Matteo said. You told me that on the first day I came to find you in the conference room. He paused. I've been thinking about it ever since. She looked at him. The night at the dinner table, he said. When I spoke in Sicilian and assumed you couldn't understand. I've been thinking about that differently since I understood who your father was and what he built. He paused. I used the language as a wall. I thought it separated me from you, put you on the other side of something I controlled. I thought that was power." He paused. "Your father understood that language was a bridge, that the people who could speak it well were the ones with the real access, not because they controlled who was inside or outside, but because they could move between worlds that didn't naturally communicate with each other. He used to say," she said quietly, "that a language was a way of seeing, not just a way of speaking. When you know a language genuinely, not technically, not academically, but genuinely the way your grandmother knew it, the way the woman who taught you from childhood knew it, you can see what the people inside that language see. You have access to the world as they experience it. And I tried to use it as a weapon," he said. "Yes, but the language is bigger than what you tried to use it for." She looked at him steadily. "That's what my answer showed you. Not that I was smarter than you, that the language was bigger than your attempt to turn it into a wall." Matteo looked at her for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one. Not the organizational acknowledgement I gave you in the conference room in the first week. A real one." He paused. "I looked at you across that dinner table, and I made a decision about your value based on your appearance and your position, and my assumptions about what both of those things meant. I used a language you were supposed to be excluded from to confirm an assessment I had already made." He paused. "I was wrong about the language. I was wrong about the assessment. And I was wrong about what I thought the situation entitled me to do." He looked directly at her. "You were never beneath my attention. You were always the most important person in that room. I was just too arrogant and too badly taught to see it." The apology sat between them. Real, direct. No architecture of authority around it. No performance. Just a man of 42 who had spent 20 years learning the wrong lessons from the wrong teacher, and who was at considerable personal cost learning different ones. "I know," she said. She said it simply, without the performance of forgiveness, either because what she felt was not the dramatic release of a wrong finally righted. It was something quieter. The specific piece of a thing that had been broken for a long time being held finally by someone with steady hands. "I know you were." "Does it matter to you," he asked, "that I understand that now?" "Yes," she said, "it matters." "Because of your father." "Because of my father," she confirmed. "And because it's true. It doesn't only matter because it connects to something larger. It matters in itself. You were wrong about what you saw when you looked at me. You've corrected that. The correction is real." She paused. "That's worth something regardless of everything else that's happened." He nodded. Then after a moment, "I still can't believe you understood every word I said that night." And there it was, the first completely unguarded thing she had heard him say. Not a strategic statement, not a careful admission, not a calculated vulnerability. Just a man genuinely astonished by a memory speaking the astonishment plainly. She smiled. A real one. The kind that reached everything. "I understood more than your language, Matteo," she said. "I understood the pain behind it." He looked at her. "What pain?" "The specific pain of a man who has been taught that he must be impenetrable," she said. "That showing anything, curiosity, uncertainty, the basic human desire to know if the person in front of you is real, is a weakness that will be used against you." She paused. "You used the insult as a form of control. But the reason you needed control in that moment was because something about me had gotten through before you had a chance to prepare for it." She looked at him steadily. "You wouldn't have said anything at all if I hadn't already made you uncertain." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that had its own texture, dense with something that had moved from one place to another and was still settling. "My uncle taught me that uncertainty was the beginning of vulnerability," Matteo said slowly. "That the moment you don't know something about the person in front of you, you are at risk." "Your uncle was wrong about most things," she said. "He was especially wrong about that." "What is uncertainty the beginning of?" he asked. And the question was genuine. The question of a man who was genuinely trying to replace a lesson with a better one. "Contact," she said. "Real contact. The thing that happens between people when they actually encounter each other rather than the performance of encountering each other. She paused. Your father tried to build an organization on contact rather than on performance. He wanted real relationships with real partners because he believed real things were more durable than constructed ones. She paused. He was right. Carlo's construction lasted 30 years. The things your father built honestly are still standing. Matteo absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, the specific quality of a person receiving something that reorganizes a belief they have held for a long time, not rejecting it or accepting it instantly, but doing the real work of integrating it. He would have liked you, Matteo said. My father, he would have liked you very much. My father liked your father, she said. I think the feeling was mutual. It was. Matteo looked at the photograph he had given her sitting now on the corner of her desk. There's a quote in the registry filing from your father's documentation. The legal team asked if there was a specific statement they should include from the Romano notebooks to represent the spirit of what he was trying to do. I chose one. He paused. I hope you'll think I chose correctly. She looked at him. Which one? He recited it from memory, and she understood that he had read it enough times to have it without trying. What is true has weight. It does not require us to carry it forever. It requires only that we carry it long enough for the right moment to arrive. The work is not in the carrying. The work is in the faith that the moment will come. She pressed her hands flat on the desk again. Her father's words, in Matteo Belandi's voice. In a public record in the city where Alessandro Romano had been called a liar by a man with more power than him. The moment had come. Her father had been right. 6 months after the night in the Belandi estate dining room when a translator answered a Mafia boss in his own language and changed the course of both their lives. Isabella Romano stood in the courtyard of the Belandi family gathering. It was an evening in early spring. The extended family, 200 people, 3 generations had assembled for the annual gathering that Vittorio Belandi had started, and that Matteo had continued, and that this year felt different from every year before it, because the organization that had gathered was not the same organization it had been a year ago. Matteo had spoken to the gathering for 40 minutes. He had told them the truth, all of it clearly, without softening the parts that reflected badly on the organization, or on Carlo, or on the years when everyone in the room had been operating inside a structure they hadn't fully understood. He had told them about the accounting, about the partners, about the changes that had been made and the changes still in progress. He had told them about Alessandro Romano. He had told them about the woman in the black dress who had answered him in Sicilian, and what that answer had made possible. People had listened in the way people listen when they are receiving something that reorganizes their understanding of where they are and how they got there. Some of them had been surprised. Some had confirmed suspicions they had carried quietly for years. Some had cried, which surprised nobody who understood that truth, when it finally arrives after a long absence, tends to land with weight. Afterward, people found Isabella. Not all at once. One by one, or in small groups, people who had something to say, or something to ask, or simply needed to be near the person their leader had pointed to as the one who had made this possible. An older woman who had known Vittorio pressed her hand without speaking. A young man in his 20s who had grown up inside the family structure said awkwardly and earnestly that he wanted to study languages because of what Matteo had described. A woman close to Isabella's age, one of the Belandi cousins, said she had heard her own father mention Alessandro Romano once years ago in a way that suggested her father had known something was wrong and had never felt able to say it. Isabella spoke to all of them. She listened to all of them. She stood in that courtyard for 3 hours, and she was present for each conversation with the full quality of her attention, which was the thing her father had given her that she had never been able to adequately describe. Not intelligence exactly, not empathy exactly, but the specific capacity to be completely there for the person in front of you, to make them feel that what they were saying was the most important thing being said anywhere in the world at that moment. Her father had had it. She had it. She had thought of it as a personal quality until she started working in translation and understood it was also a professional skill. Now standing in this courtyard, she understood it was both and more than both. It was the thing that made truth transmissible. The thing that made language not just a code, but an actual connection. Late in the evening, the courtyard had thinned to a smaller group. Matteo found her near the edge of the gathering, not seeking her out dramatically, just arriving in the same space the way people do when they have been moving through the same event, and the event is winding down. "How are you?" he asked. "Good," she said. And she meant it in the full sense, not just adequate, not just managing, but genuinely good in the way of someone who has completed something they were built to complete. "People responded to you," he said. "I watched. They found you immediately." "They found the story," she corrected gently. "I'm the way the story became accessible. That's different." "You keep doing that," he said. "Doing what?" "Correcting my attributions, redirecting credit." "I'm a translator," she said. "My job is to make the connection visible, not to be the connection." He looked at her. The evening had settled into the particular quality of late gatherings. The people still present were the ones who had a reason to stay, and the light had gone from the sharp clarity of early evening to something softer. And the ordinary sounds of the world outside the courtyard were audible in a way they hadn't been earlier when everyone was talking. "Your father spent 20 years hoping for a specific outcome," Matteo said. "He got most of it. What are you hoping for?" She thought about it. She looked at the people remaining in the courtyard, the generations of a family that had been living inside a partial truth and was now gradually building access to the complete version. She thought about the foundation documentation with her father's name on it. She thought about the young man who wanted to study languages. She thought about the filing in the Palermo registry. "I'm hoping that what's been started continues," she said. "That the organization your father wanted to build, the honest version, the one Carlo spent 30 years preventing, actually gets built. Not quickly, not perfectly, but genuinely." She paused. "And I'm hoping I get to help build it." "You will," Matteo said, without hesitation. She looked at him. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to understand that I'm asking it directly because that's the only way I know how to ask things that matter." "I know," she said. "Ask. The work you're doing here, the position, the foundation, the partnership relationships, I want to know if it's enough. If it's what you would have chosen without the history, without your father's connection to this organization." He paused. "I need to know if you're here because this is where you want to be, or because this is where the story brought you." She considered the question with the full seriousness it deserved. She thought about the canvas bag with the first notebook, the conference room, the audit, the Paris morning, the plane, the restaurant in the Quartieri Spagnoli, the photograph on her desk. She thought about what her life had been before 3 months ago. Competent professional. Good work for good clients. A life that was complete in all the ways a life can be complete, and still feel like it's waiting for something it can't name. "Both," she said. "The story brought me here, and here is where I want to be." She looked at him directly. "Those two things aren't contradictions." Matteo held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said. "They're not." The courtyard was quiet around them. The night was doing what nights do, settling into itself, becoming what it was, ordinary and enormous at once, the way all the important things in a life are ordinary and enormous at once. "My father thought you would be worth waiting for," she said. "He wrote it before he understood exactly what he was waiting for. Just that the quality was there, and that it was worth protecting." She paused. He was right. Matteo looked at her. The man who had mocked a woman across a dinner table with a language he thought belonged to him and not to her. The man who had been shaped by 20 years of wrong teaching and had carried that shaping into the room where she sat with her portfolio and her father's unfinished work, and had, when he finally had the real information, when the uncertainty he had been taught to treat as weakness finally became the opening, it had always been used it correctly. He did not say anything. Some moments don't need language, they need only the person. She looked back at the courtyard, at the people, at the family that was in the process of becoming something more accurate than what it had been. Her father had believed in the weight of truth. He had believed it found its level. He had spent 20 years carrying it to the moment when it could be set down in the right place, and he had not lived to see that moment. But the moment had come anyway, because that was what true things did. They waited and they held. And when the right person arrived with the right quality of attention, they landed exactly where they needed to be. Isabella Romano had carried her father's truth across 20 years, and 3 boxes, and a dinner table in Sicilian, and 47 pages of transcription, and a gray Paris morning, and a courtyard in Naples, in early spring. She had carried it to the right person. The weight was gone now, and in its place was something she had no precise word for in any of her 5 languages, which meant it was something real, the specific, unnamed feeling of a life that has arrived at the thing it was always moving toward, and found on arrival that the thing was better than any version of it the imagination had managed to build in advance. Alessandro Romano had written that what was true had weight, and that the work was in the faith that the moment would come. The moment had come. The work was done. And everything it had built, the foundation, the restored name, the honest organization, the man who had learned to see what was standing in front of him, would continue, would compound, would grow into something larger than what one patient man in Palermo with 3 boxes of notebooks could have imagined when he started. That was also what true things did. They did not end when the carrying stopped. They began.